As soon as we use Prof's powers, he'll know where we are. We can pick the place to fight, draw him to us.
Yeah, I said. Yeah.
Except?
Cody asked. That's what we did with Steelheart, I said softly. Drew him to our trap, away from the populace. I raised my hands to control the imager, moving us through the city toward the remnants of Sharp Tower. The drone flybys had happened right after dawn, and corpses still littered the site. Lifeline, I said, counting off the fallen epics I spotted. Minor electricity powers and telepathy. Darkness Infinity, that was her fourth name, by the way. She kept coming up with something better, and it was always worse. She could jump between shadows. Inshallah and the Tobe from Bahrain both had linguistic powers.
Linguistic powers?
Cody asked. Oh, one could force you to speak in rhyme. The other could speak in any made-up language anyone anywhere had imagined.
That's very strange.
We don't talk much about the odd powers, I said absently. But there are a lot of minor epics whose abilities are very specific. I froze. Wait. I spun us in the air, fast enough that Cody stumbled and reached out to touch the wall. I zoomed us down toward the rubble, picking out a bloodied face, the body trapped beneath the remnants of the tower's large generator. Prof's blast had vaporized only the salt. It was the first confirmation I'd had that he, with exquisite control over his powers, could release a blast that vaporized some dense materials, but not others. That wasn't important now. That face was. Oh, Calamity, I whispered.
What?
Cody demanded. That's Stormwind.
The one who
makes this city grow food, I finished. Yeah. Ildethia's food production supplied dozens of other cities, Cody. Prof's little tirade might have some very lasting consequences. I dug out my mobile and typed a message to Nighthawk. How soon after an epic dies do you need to freeze their cells? Soon, he wrote back. Most cells die quickly. CO2 poisoning, without the heart pumping blood. Epic DNA melts fast, in addition. We don't know the reason yet. Why do you ask? I think Prof just started a famine, I wrote to him. He killed an epic last night who was vital to the economy. You can try to harvest me a sample, Nighthawk replied. Some cells last longer than others. Skin cells, some stem cells. The DNA problem works on a kind of weird half-life, with most of it being gone in seconds, but some individual cells could linger. But kid, it's really hard to get a culture going from old epic cells. I showed the message to Cody.
It'll be dangerous to go out, he noted. We don't have Megan to give us new faces.
Yeah, but if we can prevent starvation, isn't it worth the risk?
Sure, Cody said. Unless we expose ourselves to Prof, who could very well have people watching those bodies, and then get ourselves killed. Which would leave only 3 Reckoners instead of 5 to confront him. Assuming he didn't torture our secrets out of us and then go kill the rest of the team, which he probably would. All for a very, very slight chance that we might be able to make a motivator that might feed people.
I swallowed. Right, fine. You laid it on a bit thick.
Yeah, well, he said. Y'all have got a history of not listening to logic.
Like your logic of modern rock and roll being derived from bagpipes?
That one's true now, Cody said. Look it up. Elvis was a Scot.
Yeah, whatever, I said, walking over to switch off the imager and a view of Stormwind's face. It hurt, but today I would hold myself back. A moment later, Mizzy poked her head into our room. Hey, she said, your girlfriend's awake. Do you want to go smooch, or... I was already on my way. 37. Megan was sitting up, holding a bottle of water in both hands, her back to the wall. I passed Abraham on my way in, and he nodded. According to his admittedly limited medical knowledge, she was fine. We'd unhooked the harm's way from her hours ago. Megan gave me a wan smile and took a pull on her water bottle. The others left us alone, Abraham steering Cody away by the shoulder. I let out a long sigh of relief as I reached Megan. Despite Abraham's assurances, a piece of me had been terrified she wouldn't wake up. Yes, she could reincarnate if killed, but what if she didn't die, just slipped into a coma? She cocked an eyebrow at my obvious relief. I feel, she said, like a barrel of green ducks at a 4th of July parade. I cocked my head, then nodded. Oh, yeah. Good metaphor. David, that was supposed to be nonsense. A joke. Really? Because it makes perfect sense. I gave her a kiss. See, you feel healed, and that's not right. Like the ducks, thinking they're out of place. But nobody's truly out of place at a parade, so they simply fit in. Like you fit in here. You're absolutely mental, she said, as I settled down beside her, my arm around her shoulders. How do you feel? Awful. So the healing didn't take? It did, she said, staring at the water bottle. Megan, it's all right. Yes, the mission went awry. We lost Tia. We're recovering from that, moving forward. I went dark, David, she said softly. Darker than I've been in a long time. Darker than when I killed Sam. Darker than I've been since before meeting you. You pulled out of it. Barely, she said, then glanced at her arm. I was supposed to be past this. We were supposed to have figured it all out. I pulled her close, and she rested her head on my shoulder. I wished I knew what to say, but everything I thought of was stupid. She didn't want false reassurances. She wanted answers. So did I. Prof killed Tia, Megan whispered. I could end up doing the same to you. Did you hear her at the end? I'd hoped you were unconscious for that part, I admitted. She said he'd warned her and she hadn't listened. David, I'm warning you. I can't control this, even with the secret of the weaknesses. Well, I said, we'll merely have to do the best we can. But, Megan, I said, lifting her head to look her in the eyes, I'd rather die than be without you. You mean that? I nodded. Selfish, she said. Do you know what it would do to me to know that I'd killed you? Then let's see that it doesn't happen, all right? I said. I don't think it will, but I'll risk it to stay near you. She breathed out and rested her head on my shoulder again. Slots. Yeah. Thanks for trying my idea with Prof. Sorry I wasn't able to make it work. Not your fault. I don't think we want to try another dimensional version of him. What then? She asked. We can't just give up. I smiled. I've got an idea. How crazy is it? Pretty darn crazy. Good, she said. The world's gone mad. Joining it is the only solution. She was quiet a moment. Do I have a part in it? Yes, but we shouldn't need you to overextend your powers. She relaxed, snuggling against my side, and we sat there together for a time. You know, I finally said, I really wish my father could have met you, because he'd be curious to meet a good epic. Well, that too, I said, but I think he'd like you. David, I'm abrasive, cocky, and loud. And brilliant, I said, and an awesome shot, commanding, decisive. My dad, he liked people who were straightforward. Said he'd rather get cussed out by someone who meant it than be smiled at by someone who didn't. Sounds like a great man. He was. The kind of man others ignored or talked over because he was too quiet and not quick with something clever, but also the kind of man who would run to help others when everyone else fled for safety. Calamity, I missed that man. I've been having nightmares, I whispered. Megan sat up, looking at me with a sharp motion. What kind? Persistent, I said. Terrible. Something about loud noises, jarring sensations. I didn't get it. I don't think it's something I'm afraid of. Any other oddities? She asked. I met her gaze. How much do you remember from Sharp Tower? She narrowed her eyes. Tia's words, and before that, gunfire. Lots of it. How did we survive that? I drew my lips to a line. Sparks, she said. How likely do you think... I mean... I don't know, I said. Could be nothing. There were a lot of powers being flung around that room. Maybe there was a leftover force field, or maybe some pocket of another reality. She rested her hand on my shoulder. Sure you want to stay around me? I asked. I'd rather die than do otherwise. She squeezed my shoulder. But I don't like this at all, David. It feels like we're holding our breath, waiting to see who explodes first. Do you think Prof and Tia had conversations like this? Where they decided it was worth the risk of remaining together? Maybe. But I don't see that we have any option but to proceed. I'm not going to leave you, and you're not going to leave me. It's like I said, we have to accept the danger. Unless there's another way, Megan said. A way to make sure I'm not a danger to you or to anyone else ever again. I frowned, uncertain what she meant, but she seemed to decide something, looking at me, and she lifted her hand to caress my face. You can't say you haven't considered it.
Excuse me.
Softly. It? The entire time he's been here, Megan said. I've wondered, is this my way out? Megan, I don't understand. She stood up. It's not enough to make promises. It's not enough to hope I won't end up hurting you. She turned and strode unsteadily at first from the room. I scrambled to my feet and followed, trying to sort out what she was planning. Salt scuffed under our feet as we walked past a table in the main room where the others sat. This building's time had come, and it was too near to the trailing edge of Ildethia. It wouldn't last the night. Megan crossed the room and walked into Larsener's smaller chamber. Sparks! I jogged after her, stumbling into the room. There was a way to make sure Megan never hurt anyone with her powers again. It was here, inside our base. Megan, I said, seizing her by the arm. Are you sure you want to do something so drastic? She studied Larsener, who lay on a plush couch with his headphones on. He didn't notice us. Yes, she whispered. During my time with you, I've started to lose my hatred of the powers. I started to think it could be controlled. But after the things that happened last night, I don't want this anymore, David. She looked to me questioningly. I shook my head. I won't stop you. This is your choice. But maybe we should think about it some more. This from you? She said with a grim smile. No. I might lose my nerve. She strode up to Larsener, and when he didn't notice her, she kicked at his foot, which was dangling over the side of his couch. He immediately pulled off his headphones and scrambled up. You drudge, he snapped. Useless peasant. I'll... Megan thrust her arm toward him, wrist upward. Take my powers. Larsener gaped, then backed away from her, regarding the arm like one might regard a ticking box with the words, "Not a bomb," stenciled on it. What are you babbling about? My powers, Megan said, stepping toward him. Take them. They're yours. You're insane. No, she said, just tired. Go ahead. He didn't reach for her arm. I strongly suspected that no epic had ever offered to give him their powers before. I stepped up to Megan. I spent months in Babelar serving regalia, Megan said to Larsener. All because of the implication that she could make Calamity remove my powers. I wish I'd known about you. I would simply have come here. Take them. They'll make you immortal. I'm already immortal, he snapped. Then be double immortal, Megan said. Or quadruple, or whatever. Take them, or I'll reach into another dimension and I'll... He grabbed her arm. She gasped, jerking upright, but didn't pull her arm away. I steadied her by her shoulders, worried. Sparks. Watching her was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Should I have persuaded her to wait? To think it over? Like ice water, she hissed. In my veins. Yes, Larsener said. I've heard it is unpleasant. Now it's become fire, Megan said, trembling. Pouring through me. Her eyes went glassy and unfocused. Larsener said, his tone like that of a careful surgeon. Yes. Megan jerked, growing tense, staring into the distance. Perhaps you should have thought this through before prancing in here and making demands, Larsener said. Enjoy being even more of a peasant. I'm sure you'll fit in brilliantly with this crew, if you can even think straight when this is done. Most can't, you see. The room caught fire. I ducked as ribbons of flame lanced across the ceiling, then down the walls. The heat was distant, subtle, but I could feel it. Megan stood up straight, and her trembling ended. Larsener let go, then looked at his hands. He seized Megan again, sneering, and she met his eyes. There was no trembling this time, no jerk of pain, though her face tightened as she clenched her jaw. The flames didn't go away. They were a phantom, burning. She'd said that she'd learned to create those dimensional shadows to help hide her weakness and her fear of fire. They came out by instinct. The room started to grow very hot. Larsener let go of her hand and backed away. You can't take them, it seems, Megan said. How? He demanded. How do you defy me? I don't know, Megan said. But I was wrong to come here. She turned and strode from the room. I followed her, confused. Abraham and Mizzy stood at the doorway, and Megan brushed past them. I gave them a shrug as I followed her into the communal bedroom. You really still have the powers? I asked her. She nodded, looking tired. She slumped down onto her pallet. I should have guessed it wouldn't be so easy. I knelt beside her, hesitant, but also relieved. Had it been a roller coaster of emotions, the type that was old and rickety and didn't have proper seatbelts. You all right? I asked. Yeah, she said. I don't understand it either. It was strange, David. In that moment, with him sucking my abilities out in that wave of ice, I realized that the powers are as much me now as my personality. She closed her eyes. I realized I couldn't give them to him. If I did, I'd become a coward. But how did you defy him? I said. I've never heard of something like that happening. The powers are mine, she whispered. I claim them. My burden, my task, my self. I don't know why that mattered, but it did. She opened her eyes. So what now? When we were at Sharp Tower, I said, I visited the other world, the one where Firefight lives. There's no darkness there, Megan. Steelheart is a hero. So we got born one dimensional degree away from paradise. We'll just have to bring paradise here, I told her. Regalia's plan was for Prof to travel to Calamity and, once there, steal his powers. If we can get Prof back, he'll give us the teleportation device she developed. Seems like that would give us a pretty good opportunity to kill Calamity and free us all. She smiled and took me by the arm. Let's do it. Rescue Prof. Bring down Calamity. Save the world. What's your plan? Well, I said, it's not fully formed yet. Good, she said. You have great ideas, David, but your execution is crap. Go grab some paper. We're going to come up with a way to pull this off. 38. I set down my pack in the center of the large open building. The place had a sharp, salty scent, newly grown. The floor reflected my mobile's light, polished white saltstone. After leaving behind a hideout that had literally been decomposing around us, this place felt almost too clean, like a baby the moment before it barfed on you.
This feels wrong,
I said, my voice echoing in the large chamber.
In what way?
Mizzy said, passing with a sack of supplies over her shoulder.
It's too big,
I said.
I can't feel like I'm hiding if I have a whole warehouse to live in.
One would think,
Abraham said, setting down his supplies with a clink,
you would be happy to escape the tight confines of our previous dwellings.
I turned around and felt distinctly creeped out that, by the frail light of my mobile, I couldn't see the edges of the room. How could I explain that sensation without sounding silly? Every Reckoner hideout had been tucked away and secure. This empty warehouse was the opposite. Cody claimed it would be secure anyway. Our time in Ildethia had let him and Abraham do some investigating, and they'd come up with this warehouse as a spot nobody used, and one that was convenient to a spot I wanted to use in our plan to attack Prof. I shook my head, grabbing my pack and lugging it across the room to the far wall, where Abraham and Mizzy had set theirs. Nearby, Cody had already started growing a smaller room inside the warehouse. He worked carefully with a gloved hand, stroking the salt outward like he was sculpting clay, using the trowel to make smooth surfaces. His glove hummed softly, making the crystal structure of the salt extend behind his motions. He'd only been working for about an hour, but he already had a good start on the smaller chamber.
Ain't nobody gonna bother us here, lad, Cody said in a reassuring voice as he worked.
Why not?
I asked.
Seems like a perfect place to hole up a large group of people.
I could imagine the warehouse filled with families, each around their own trash can fire. That would transform it. Rather than being tomb-like and empty, it would be full of sounds and life.
This place is too far away from the city center. It's from the northern edge of the section of Old Atlanta that became Ildethia. Why pick the cold warehouse when you can have a group of townhomes for your family?
I suppose that makes sense, I said.
Plus, a whole bunch of people got murdered in here, Cody added. So nobody wants to be near the place.
What?
Yeah, he said. Tragic event. Bunch of kids started playing here. But it was too close to another family's territory. The other family got spooked, thought rivals were moving in on them, so they tossed some dynamite through the door. They say they could hear the survivors crying under the rubble for days, but a full-on war had started by then, and nobody had time to come help the poor kids.
I regarded him, stunned. Cody started whistling and continued to work. Sparks. He had to be making that story up, right? I turned and took in the vast, empty room, then shivered. I hate you, I muttered.
Ah, now, don't be like that. Ghosts are drawn to negative emotions, you see.
I should have known better. Talking to Cody was generally among the least productive things you could do. I went looking for Megan instead, passing Larsener, who, of course, had refused to help carry anything to the new base. He swept into Cody's unfinished chamber and flopped down, an overstuffed beanbag materializing beneath him.
I'm tired of being interrupted, he said, pointing at the wall.
A door appeared, propped up against it.
Work that into your construction, and I'll put a lock on the thing. Oh, and make the walls extra thick, so I don't have to listen to the lot of you squeaking and babbling all the time.
Cody gave me a long-suffering look, and somehow I could tell that he was contemplating walling the epic up. I found Megan with Mizzy, near where Abraham was unpacking his guns. I held back, surprised. Megan and Mizzy sat on the floor surrounded by our notes, some in my careful hand, others in her... Well, Megan's handwriting could be mistaken for the aftermath of a tornado in a pencil store. Mizzy nodded as Megan pointed at one page, then gestured wildly at the sky. Megan thought a moment, then huddled over the paper and started writing. I sidled up to Abraham. "The two of them are talking," I said.
You expected maybe clucking?
"Well, shouting, or strangulation." Abraham turned back to unloading equipment from his bags. I started toward the women, but Abraham took me by the arm without looking up.
Perhaps it would be best to simply let them be, David.
"But
they're adults,"
Abraham said.
"They do not need you to work out their problems."
I folded my arms, huffing. What did their being adults have to do with it? Plenty of adults did need me to work out their problems. Otherwise, Steelheart would still be alive. Besides, Mizzy was 17. Did that even count as an adult? Abraham removed something from one of the packs and set it down with a soft thump.
"Instead of poking where you aren't needed," he said to me, "how about you help where you are? I could use your aid."
"Doing what?" Abraham lifted the top of the box, revealing a pair of gloves and a jug of sparkling mercury.
"Your plan is daring, as I would expect. It is also simple. The best often are. But it does require me to do things I am not sure I can do."
He was right. The plan was simple. It was also exceptionally dangerous. Nighthawk had used drones to explore a few of the caverns underneath Ildithia, the ones Dig Zone had created long ago. There were many under the region, tunneled into the rock here. Ildithia was passing over a large set of them, and we'd chosen this warehouse in part because here we could dig down into one of the caverns and practice there. Our plan was to train for a month. By then, Ildithia would have left these caverns behind, but they would still make a perfect location for a trap. Lots of tunnels, places to set up explosives, or to plot escape routes. We'd be familiar with the tunnels, which would give us an edge in the fight. Once we were ready, we'd sneak from the city and go back to the caves. From there, we could lure Prof out. All it would take was using the motivators based on his powers, and he'd come right to us. Ildithia would be miles away, and safe from whatever destruction happened during our fight. Abraham and Megan would hit him first. The idea was to wear him down before revealing Cody wearing the full tensor suit, as we were calling the set of devices that mimicked Prof's power portfolio. It hadn't arrived yet, but Nighthawk claimed it was on its way. So once Abraham and Megan had worn Prof down a little, Cody would appear, manifesting all of Prof's powers. We had to hope that Tavi's power hadn't been recognized by Prof as being his. After all, her force fields had been a different color. A piece of me whispered that there might be a larger problem. Prof had been wounded by Tavi's force fields, but they hadn't shut down his powers completely, like what happened with Megan and most epics. Could Tia have been wrong? I decided that she wasn't. But now, confronted with one last shot at stopping Prof, I wavered. Some things about Prof and his powers didn't add up. What was it that Prof feared?
"For this to work,"
Abraham said from beside me, snapping me out of my introspection,
"I will need to be able to use the Urteach to face Prof, and facing him will require not getting squished by his force fields."
"The Urteach should be enough," I said. "The structural integrity of the mercury will be..."
"I believe your notes,"
Abraham cut me off, pulling on the gloves.
"But I'd still rather do some testing, followed by much practice."
I shrugged. "What did you have in mind?" What he had in mind, apparently, was to put me to work. Our warehouse had a little loft inside it. I spent the next hour working with Cody, who created some large slabs of saltstone in the loft. I then lashed these together and positioned them, in several bunches, ready to push them off the loft. Finally, I wiped my brow with a rag that was already soaked through, then settled down with my legs hanging over the ledge. Below, Abraham practiced. He developed his own training regimen with the Urteach, based on some old martial art. He stepped into the center of a ring of lights he'd set out on the ground, thrust his hands to one side, then pulled them back and thrust them the other way. Mercury danced around him. At first it covered his arm, like a silvery sleeve and glove. As he thrust his hands forward, it sprayed outward, becoming a disc connected to his palm. When he moved back into his martial arts motions, it withdrew and covered his arms again, then shot into the shape of a spike as he thrust his hands the other way. I watched hungrily. The metal moved with a beautiful, otherworldly flow, reflecting light as it snaked around Abraham's arms. First one, then across his shoulders to the other, like something alive. He turned and ran, then leaped, and the mercury coursed down his legs, becoming a short pillar that Abraham landed upon. It held his weight, though it looked spindly and frail. "Ready?" I called from above.
Ready,
he called. "Be careful," I said. "I don't want this crushing you." He gave no response, so I sighed, then stood and used a crowbar to pry one of the large, lashed-together slabs of saltstone off the loft and send it tumbling toward him. The idea was for him to create a thin line of mercury in the path of the falling slabs, then see how much the impact twisted the mercury. Instead, Abraham stepped directly into the path of the stones and raised his hand. My view was obstructed, but best I could figure, Abraham caused the mercury to run up his side and arm, becoming a long ribbon that extended from his palm, down his side, and to his feet to form a kind of brace. My breath caught as the saltstone plummeted toward him. I craned my neck to look down, and the pile hit hard, bouncing off Abraham, the lashings snapping. The slabs crashed to the sides, revealing Abraham grinning below, his hand still raised, his palm coated with mercury. The brace had been enough to deflect the weight of the slabs. "That was foolhardy," I called to him. "Stop trying to put me out of a job."
better to know now if this will work, he called back to me, than to find out in the middle of a fight with Prof. Besides, I was relatively certain.
"Still want to try this next part?" Cody asked, coming up beside me, sniper rifle on his shoulder.
"Yes, please,"
Abraham said, thrusting his hand toward us and making the shield. It grew as large as he was, shimmering and incredibly thin. I looked at Cody, then shrugged and put my hands over my ears. A series of shots followed. Fortunately, they were suppressed, so the ear-holding wasn't as necessary as it might have been. The mercury puckered, catching the bullets. Or, well, it stopped them, which upon consideration wasn't all that impressive, as bodies technically did that all the time. Mine had done so on occasion. Still, the mercury didn't tear or split, so it was an effective shield. Though, unfortunately, the application was limited. Abraham didn't have superhuman reflexes. He wouldn't be able to stop bullets already fired. He turned, and the mercury flowed back to him, scattering the bullets to the floor. It ran down his arm and then his leg before streaking from his feet to form a series of steps rising toward me. He walked up them, grinning widely. I shoved down my envy. I doubted I'd ever stop wishing I had been able to make this device work, but I could avoid acting childish about it. Cody and I clapped Abraham on the shoulder, giving him a thumbs up. The Canadian man bore an uncharacteristic smile of pleasure, which was good to see. It wasn't that he never smiled, it was just that his smiles always seemed so controlled. He rarely seemed to enjoy life. It was more that he let it pass around him, regarding it curiously, like a rock watching a river.
"Maybe this will actually work," he said to me. "Maybe we won't all end up dead."
He held up his hand. And
Why do you have to
ran
say
up his
that?
arm, pooling in a sphere above his gloved palm. It rippled and shook like a miniature ocean with waves and a tide. "Do a puppy next," Mizzy called from below. Oh, then a hat! Make me a silver hat! A tiara!
Shut it, you.
Abraham called. My pocket buzzed. I pulled out my mobile, finding yet another text from Nighthawk. The guy considered me his personal entertainment factory. I flipped the message open. Jonathan contacted me again today. He's discovered you sent him on a wild rat chase? Rat? I've never seen a goose, I wrote back to him. Don't know why you'd chase one, but New Cago has lots of rats. And you'd chase those instead? Never mind. Kid, Jonathan sent a message to me for you. I felt cold, then waved for Abraham and Cody to step over and read along with me. He said, Nighthawk continued, that you have 2 days to turn over Larsener to him, or he'll destroy New Cago, every single person in it, then Babalar the next day. Abraham and I shared a look. Do you think he could actually do that? Nighthawk wrote. Destroy a whole city?
Yes,
Abraham said softly.
If he killed Tia, he's capable of anything.
I think he's asking if Prof has the power to do it, I said.
Didn't you say you talked to Obliteration at the party?
Abraham asked. Yeah, and he implied that Prof had summoned him by using a device linked to Obliteration's powers, even though Regalia made the bombs to hide her true goal, the teleportation device. I think it's safe to assume Prof has access to at least one bomb.
He has the capability,
Abraham said.
And we have to assume he'll do it, which means...
We have a new deadline, I said, tucking away the mobile. So much for our month of preparation. 39. The drone landed on our warehouse roof that night. 4 of us waited in a silent huddle, cloaked in darkness, while Cody scanned the city from inside a sniper nest he'd made on the rooftop nearby. I reached into my pocket and clicked a button on my mobile. Its screen went dark. The click sent a message I'd prepared earlier. Drone has landed the prize. We're inspecting it now. We knelt over the drone, night vision goggles in place, looking at a world painted green. Mizzy pulled the drone open. Inside, packed in straw mixed with old newspapers, was a glorious sight. A vest, a small metal box, and a pair of gloves. I breathed out. Those gloves looked exactly like the Tensor's, black with lines of metal running like tiny rivers up the fingers and pooling at each tip. Those would glow green when engaged. Nice, Mizzy whispered, poking at the vest. 3 different motivator casings. The first one offers healing, judging by the sensors you attach to the skin. It probably activates automatically upon injury. This one is connected to the tensors. Last one for force fields. She turned over one of the gloves. I couldn't help feeling that this suit represented something new, a different step in the creation of epic-derived technology. Instead of one lone power, this replicated everything Prof could do. A complex network of wires and multiple motivators, combined in an imitation of an enhanced human. Should I be disturbed or impressed? Heroes will come, son, my father's words. I thought of that as I ran my fingers along the sleek metal of the suit's motivators. But sometimes you have to help them along.
There is a problem with this,
Abraham said.
Cody cannot practice with this device without alerting Prof that he's using it, and therefore revealing ourselves to him.
I've got an idea for that, I said, though it will require Megan to use her powers. She looked up at me, curious. I doubt Prof can sense Cody practicing, I said. If he's in another dimension. Clever, she said. He'll only be able to stay a short time, though. 10, maybe 15 minutes, if I push it. Don't push it, I said. It might not give us much time, but at least we'll be able to make sure the motivators are working. Everyone seemed to like this plan. and together we dug out the tensor suit. Beneath were some other supplies that we'd managed to beg off Nighthawk. Some explosives, some tiny drones that were little more than cameras with feet, and some technological gizmos Mizzy had suggested as additions to Megan's and my plan. The others carted all this away, Mizzy placing the old harm's way in the drone, the one that had healed Megan and me, and sending it off to return to Nighthawk. We had something better now, though we'd have to be careful about using it lest we alert Prof. I caught Megan by the arm as the team passed, carrying the goodies. She nodded to me. She felt all right about using her powers. I didn't follow her into the warehouse below, but instead walked over to Cody's sniper nest. It was my turn to be on watch. The nest was shaped like a wide, shallow box near the center of the roof. Cody had devised a ceiling for it with the crystal grower that merged right into the roof and made the structure look like another normal building feature. It had slits on all sides, however, and a large enough hole at the rear for you to crawl in and lie down. I peeked in. The lanky southerner was cuddled into the hole like a joey in its mother's pouch, though people really shouldn't let baby kangaroos play with a Barrett 50 cal with armor-piercing rounds.
Has my new toy arrived?
Cody asked, setting aside the gun and wriggling backward out of the nest. Yeah, I said, stepping out of his way as he stood up. It looks great.
You sure you don't want to pilot it, lad?
I shook my head. You have more experience with the tensors, Cody.
Yeah, but you were way more talented with them.
I swallowed. No, I need to be running the mission from behind.
Right then,
he said, turning toward the steps down to the building. Cody, I said, and he stopped, turned back. The other day I was talking to Abraham and, well, he kind of bit my head off.
Ah, you were poking around, were you?
Poking around?
In his past.
No, of course not. I just asked why he didn't want to be in charge.
Close enough,
Cody said, patting me on the arm.
Abraham's a strange one, lad. The rest of us, we make sense. You fight for revenge. I fight because I was a cop and I took an oath. Mizzy, she fights because of her heroes, people like Val and Sam. She wants to be like them. Abraham, though, why does he fight? I couldn't tell you. Because of his fallen brothers and sisters in the Special Forces? Maybe. But he doesn't seem to be holding a grudge. Maybe to protect the country? But if that's the case, why is he down here in the fractured states? All I've been able to figure is that he doesn't want to talk about it, and you shouldn't assume he's gentle because he's in control, lad. Cody rubbed his jaw. Learned that the hard way once.
He punched you?
Broke my jaw,
Cody said with a laugh.
Don't poke, kid. That's what I learned.
He seemed not to care much, though a broken jaw sounded like a pretty big offense to me. But then, who hadn't wanted to punch Cody on occasion? Thanks, I said, sitting down to begin wiggling into the sniper nest. But you're wrong about me, Cody. I don't fight for revenge, not anymore. I fight for my father.
Isn't that the same as revenge?
I reached into my shirt and took out the small S-shaped symbol of the faithful that I wore around my neck. The mark of one who awaited a day when the heroes would come. No, I don't fight because of his death, Cody. I fight for his dreams. Cody nodded.
Good on you, lad,
he said, turning to walk to the steps.
Good on you.
I crawled into the sniper nest, head brushing the low ceiling, and lifted Cody's rifle, patching my mobile into it. I pulled off my night vision goggles and used the gun's scope instead. It had an overlaid map of the area, as well as thermal imaging. Better than either, the rifle had an advanced sound detection system. It would alert me if it heard anything nearby, creating a small blip on my map. At the moment, nothing. Not even pigeons. I lay there positioned on cushions Cody had left. Occasionally I would twist about in the square enclosure, poking my rifle out one of the other sides. Sounds came from below inside the warehouse. I checked in with the others, and Mizzy said that my idea, sending Cody into the parallel dimension to practice, was working. Said he had to frighten some kids away over there, who were living in the warehouse in that dimension, but otherwise he hadn't encountered anyone. I checked on an oddity after that, noise the rifle had picked up, but it turned out to be a few scavengers moving through the alleyway. They didn't stop at our warehouse. Instead, they continued on toward the outskirts of the city. This let me have an extended period alone to think. My mind wandered in the silence, and I realized something was nagging at me. I was dissatisfied, though annoyingly I couldn't figure out exactly why. Something bothered me, either about the place we'd set up or the plan we'd made. What was I missing? I mulled it all over for about an hour, only a fraction of my shift, and was actually glad when the alarm on my gun buzzed again. I zoomed in on the source of the disturbance, but it was just a feral cat scampering along a rooftop nearby. I watched it carefully, in case it was some kind of shape-shifting epic. By this time, light had dawned on the horizon, and I yawned, licking my lips and tasting salt. I wouldn't be sad to be away from this place. Unfortunately, my watch was a full 8 hours, which would include another 6 hours of dullness until noon arrived. I yawned again and rubbed my fingernail on the rooftop's saltstone rim in front of me. Curiously, our warehouse was still growing. The changes were minute, but looking closely, I could see that vines as thin as pencil lines were growing along the saltstone, as if carved by an invisible hand. The city's major changes happened on the first and last days of a building's life, but the times between weren't static. Tiny ornamentations often popped up, ones that would be gone in another day or two, weathered away by the inevitable decay that was this city's infinite cycle. The alarm on my rifle buzzed again, and I looked through the scope at the map. The sound was coming from on top of our warehouse, and a moment later I heard footsteps grinding on the saltstone. They came from the direction of the staircase from the building below, the one that led from the loft to the roof. It was likely one of my team. Still, I carefully slipped my mobile out the side of the sniper hole using its camera, which had a feed to the scope, to see who was up there. It was Larsener. I hadn't been expecting that. I couldn't recall him setting foot outside his room at any of the 3 bases, except during times when we'd needed to transition from one to the other. He stood with his hand shading his face, scowling at the distant sunrise. "Larsener?" I asked, crawling back out of the sniper hole, rifle in tow. "Is everything all right?" "People enjoy these," he said. "What?" I asked, following his gaze. "Sunrises?" "They always talk about the sunrise," he said, sounding annoyed. "How beautiful it is, blah, blah. Like each one is some unique wonder. I don't see it." "Are you crazy?" "I'm increasingly certain," he said dryly, "that I'm the only one on this planet who isn't." "Then you must be blind," I said, looking toward the sunrise. As sunrises went, it wasn't much. It didn't have clouds to reflect off, and today it was pretty much uniformly one color instead of spanning the spectrum. "A ball of fire," he said. "Garish orange. Harsh light." "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Amazing." I thought of the years in New Cago's darkness, when we'd judged the time of day by the dimness of the lights. I thought of emerging to an open sky for the first time since my childhood, watching the sun come up and bathe everything in warmth. The sunrise didn't need to be beautiful to be beautiful. "I come look at them sometimes," Larsener said, "just to see if I can pick out what everyone else seems to see." "Hey," I said, "how much do you know about the way this city grows?" "Why does it matter?" "Because it's interesting," I said, kneeling down. "Do you see this vine work? It's still growing. Is that because the original warehouse had this pattern in its brick and wood? I mean, it wouldn't make much sense if it did, but the other option would be that the powers are making art here. Isn't that odd?" I really couldn't say. I looked at him. You don't know, do you? You absorbed this power when you took over the city, but you don't know how it works. I know that it does what I want. What else matters? Beauty, I said, rubbing my finger along one of the vines. My father always said that the epics were wonderful, amazing. A glimpse of something truly divine, you know? It's easy to pay attention to the destruction, like what obliteration did to Kansas City. But there's beauty, too. It almost makes me feel bad to kill epics. He sniffed disdainfully. I see through your act, David Charleston. My act? I stood back up and turned toward him. The act of despising epics, he said. You hate them, yes, but as the mouse hates the cat. The hate of envy, the hate of the small who wishes to be great. Don't be silly. Silly? Larsener asked. You think it isn't obvious? A man does not study, learn, obsess as you have because of hatred. No. These are the signs of lust. You have sought a father among the epics, a lover among them. He stepped toward me. Admit it. You want nothing more than to be one of us. I loved Megan before I realized what she was, I said. Teeth clenched, shocked at the sudden anger I felt. You don't know anything. Don't I? He said. I've watched people like you so many times. You see the truth of men manifest in those first moments, David. New epics. They murder, they destroy. They show what every man would do if his inhibitions were removed. Men are a race of monsters, inefficiently chained. That's what's inside you. Deny it. I dare you. Deny it. Man who presumes to know epics better than he knows himself. I didn't dare. I spun from him and climbed back into the sniper nest to finish my shift. Eventually, he grumbled behind me and left. Hours passed. I couldn't shake the things Larsener had said, though I tried. As noon approached, and the time for my shift to end, I found myself fixating on something he'd said to me. Man who presumes to know epics better than he knows himself. Did I really know them? I knew their powers, yes, but not the epics themselves. They weren't all of one mind. That was one of the easy mistakes people made. Epics felt an overwhelming sense of arrogance, so you could predict some of their actions, but they were still people, individuals. No, I didn't know them. But I did know Prof. Oh, Calamity, I thought. It finally came together. The thing that had been bothering me. I pulled out of my sniper nest and dashed down the steps into the warehouse. I stumbled out of the stairwell into the loft, running to the edge to look at the warehouse floor below. Mizzy sat on a table, spinning her keys around her finger, while Megan sat cross-legged on the floor, concentrating. Near Megan, the air shimmered, and Cody appeared. Well, Cody said, I think I'm getting the hang of this. It seems way more powerful than the tensors were back in New Chicago. Full-blown force field walls work too. Guys, I shouted. David lad, Cody called up. This dimensional deal is working great. Why, I shouted, would Prof give us a 2-day deadline? They all regarded me in silence. To make us panic? Mizzy asked. Force us to give in? That's why you usually give deadlines, right? No. Look at it like a reckoner, I said, frustrated. Assume that Prof is plotting, like we are. Assume he's formed his own team, his own plan to attack. We're thinking of him like some faceless despot, but he's not. He's one of us. That deadline is way too suspicious. Sparks, Megan said, standing up. Sparks! In this case, you'd only give a 2-day deadline. Because you're planning to attack in 1 day, Abraham finished. If not sooner. We need to pull out, I said. Out of this location, out of the city. Move! 40. The subsequent mad scramble had some order to it, as we never set up a base without first preparing to pull out. The team knew what to do, even if there was a lot of cursing and some chaos. I dashed down the steps, almost colliding with Mizzy, who was on her way up to the loft to get our extra ammunition and explosives, which we kept far from where we slept. Abraham went for our power cells and guns, where he'd set them out along the wall. Cody went running toward the door. I stopped him with a barked, "Wait!" He froze and turned toward me, still in the tensor suit. "Megan," I said, "you're on scouting duty instead of Cody. Cody, you do her job and get the food rations ready. That suit is too valuable to risk out there, in case there's some sort of trap waiting for a scout." Megan obeyed immediately, and I tossed her Cody's rifle as she passed. Cody hiked back, looking a little sullen, but started gathering our packs together, checking to make sure each one had food, water, and a bedroll. I hurried to text Nighthawk. "Our location might be compromised," I sent him. "We are pulling out. Would you mind lending me one or two of the drones you have patrolling the area?" He didn't reply immediately, so I hurried to help Mizzy with the ammo and explosives. She nodded in gratitude as I took the armful from her. "Goodbye gift?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but only if you can do it quickly. I want out of here in 5. "Got it," she said, scrambling up to the loft. She'd have an explosive charge set and ready to blast the entire warehouse to dust by the time we were done packing. "Make sure there's a remote way to disarm it," I called after her, remembering Cody's story about the dead kids, which I was almost certain was made up. I placed the ammo in the backpacks, which Cody had set out in a row, bedrolls attached at the top, then zipped each one. There were packs for all of us but Abraham, who would be carrying a larger duffel with gravitonic lifts, filled with our guns and power cells. My mobile buzzed. "How do you know I still have drones in the area?" Nighthawk wrote. "Because you're paranoid?" I wrote back. "And you want to keep an eye on Prof?" I slung one pack over my shoulder, then set a second one at my feet. I'd be carrying Megan's until she could meet up with us. "You really are smarter than you seem," he wrote me. "Fine, I'll do a sweep of your area and send you the video." I waited, anxious, as Abraham finished his packing. Mizzy hurried down to grab her bag and nodded at me. Cody already had his on his shoulder. Under 5 minutes. Nearby, Larsener wandered out of the little room Cody had made for him. "Did I miss something?" he asked. "Crap," Megan said over the line. I put my hand on my earpiece. "What?" "He's got an entire army working its way through the streets toward us, Knees. Our primary exit points are both blocked. By the time we picked up on this from the sniper nest, we'd have been surrounded. We might be already." "Pull back," I said. "I'm going to get intel through Nighthawk." "Roger." I looked to the others. "False faces?" Mizzy asked. "Whatever our faces are, we're going to look sparking suspicious with all this equipment," I said.
"Then we leave it," Abraham said. "We're not ready for a fight."
"And we'll be more ready in 24 hours?" I asked. "When he destroys New Cago?" My phone buzzed. Nighthawk was actually calling me, which was rare. I picked up, dialing his feed into our communal line so everyone could hear him through their earpieces.
You guys are screwed, he said. I'm sending you footage in infrared.
Abraham stepped over, lowering his mobile, and we crowded around to look. A map of our area showed hundreds, maybe thousands of people descending on our position, each an infrared dot. They formed a complete circle.
East Lane, Nighthawk said. See those corpses? Bystanders who tried to run. They're gunning down anyone who attempts to escape that circle. They're sending a team into every building, holding the people there at gunpoint and, best I can tell from the shot I got through a window, feeling their faces.
"Feeling their faces?" Mizzy asked. "To see if any part is illusory," I said. "Prof knows that Megan can fool a dowser, but the overlays she creates are still illusions. They feel a nose that doesn't fit the image of its face. Something like that. And they'll know they've found us.
Like I said,
Nighthawk added.
screwed.
Megan rushed in through the door and closed it behind her, back up against the saltstone. Surrounded? She asked, reading our expressions. I nodded. So what do we do? She asked, joining our little huddle. I looked at the others, one at a time. They nodded.
We fight,
Abraham said softly. We fight, Mizzy agreed. He'll be expecting us to try to punch out. It's reckoner protocol when surprised or outmatched. I smiled, feeling a sudden swell of pride. If this were one of Prof's teams, I said, we'd run.
We're not his team, Cody said. Not
We're
anymore.
yours.
We're here to change the world. We ain't going to do that without a fight.
It's stupid.
I thought he was going to say we're your team.
Sometimes stupid is right, Megan said, then paused. Hell, I hope nobody ever quotes me on that one. So where's our battlefield? Same place it was always going to be, I said. And I pointed down. That tunnel and cave complex was beneath us. Cody, cut us a path. We go in full gear exactly as we planned. We won't have as much of an edge as we hoped, but we've still got those caverns mapped, and they'll allow us to fight him with the least chance of causing harm to people nearby. Wait, Megan said. If Cody uses the tensors, that will call Prof right to us. He'll know that we have the device.
Yeah,
Nighthawk said over the line.
he's hovering at the rear of his little army right now, but that won't last long. Years ago, when we tested it, using a motivator drove him into a rage. He'll come for you immediately.
Cody looked at his hands. Lad, I just started practicing with these tensors. They're stronger than the ones we had before, but it could take hours for me to cut an escape hole. It shouldn't, I said. You've seen what Prof can do. Level buildings, vaporize huge swaths of ground. You hold that power, Cody. Cody set his jaw. The tensors started glowing green. None of us asked how Prof had located us. It could have happened in one of any number of ways. Our bases here in Ildethia weren't terribly secure. Maybe we'd been spotted by an informant, or perhaps Prof did have an epic who could douse for us. Or maybe he'd noticed the drone deliveries.
All right, Cody said. Everyone get ready, and then I'll do the deed. Time to fight.
41. The team loaded up, weapons in hand, mobiles strapped to arms, earpieces in. Mizzy tossed a small box to each of us, a compressed rappelling cord. I affixed mine to my belt. We left our packs, only grabbing some ammo. The packs were for long-term survival. After this, one way or another, we wouldn't need them. Tension laced the air, like the distant scent of smoke that signaled a fire. We weren't ready, but the battle had arrived anyway. Right now, it was all up to Cody. He stood in the center of our warehouse base, eyeing the dusty saltstone floor. He'd always seemed lanky in an almost comical way to me. But now, wearing the tensor suit, with its glowing greens and dramatic futuristic vest, he cut an imposing profile. I stepped up to him. It's down there, Cody, I said. An entire cave complex. The battlefield we have chosen. All we need is a pathway. He took in a deep breath. Remember what you said when you were first training me in the tensors? I asked.
Yeah. You gotta use them like you're caressing a beautiful woman.
I was thinking more of the other thing you said. You've got to have the soul of a warrior, like William Wallace.
William Wallace got murdered, lad.
Oh.
But he didn't go down without a fight,
Cody said, steeling himself.
All right. Hold on to your haggis, everyone.
He raised his hands before himself, and a green glow ran down the wires strapped to his arms and into his hands. He thrust his hands forward, and I felt a distinct hum that seemed to vibrate all the way down to my soul without actually making a sound. A A 3-foot by 3-foot section of ground vaporized, maybe 10 feet deep. That was very impressive on the old scale of the tensors, but nowhere near what we needed to reach those caverns.
Jonathan's moving,
Nighthawk said over the lines.
Sparks, you people are in trouble. He does not look happy.
Cody swore under his breath, regarding the patch of floor that had been reduced to fine grains of sand. Wind from the open door of the loft curled some of the powder up in the draft. I grabbed Cody's arm.
Try again.
David, that's as big as I can make it, he said. Cody, I said, concentrate. Soul of a warrior. If I keep screwing this up, lad, we're dead. Trapped in here, gunned down. Hell of a lot of pressure to work under. Sure, I said, frantic. But, no more pressure than when you stopped those terrorists from launching the nukes at Scotland that one time, right? He glanced at me, brow beading with sweat. Then he grinned. How'd y'all know about that? Lucky guess. Cody, you can do this. He focused again on the floor in front of him. His suit started glowing once more. Ribbons of emerald coursing along his arms, pulsing like a heartbeat. Being so near made me feel something familiar, like hearing the voice of an old friend. It reminded me of days in the caverns of Nukago, of innocence and conviction. Cody raised his hands over his head, and the thrumming grew louder. Like caressing a woman, he whispered. A very, very large woman. He released the power with a defiant shout, and it blasted into the floor with such force that it sent me to my knees. Inches before me, the ground disintegrated into a large hole filled with grains of salt. I watched as the grains siphoned away to reveal a hole a good 5 feet across. It curved downward with smooth, glassy sides, traveling through saltstone and then actual rock. The vanishing salt indicated that it opened into something much larger below. Remind me, I said to Cody, never to let you caress me. He grinned, holding up hands that glowed bright green.
He'll be there any second, you slonces,
Nighthawk said over the line.
He's taking it more slowly than I'd have expected. He's a careful one to be sure, but he's still almost upon you. I'd vacate if I were you.
Down, I said, catching my Gottschalk as Abraham tossed it to me. Remember starting positions. Mizzy skidded to the side of the hole and, using a large tube-like gun, planted a series of spikes into the floor there. She hooked her rappelling cord to one, then jumped in. Megan hooked on to another spike, then followed, sliding down the hole like it was a ride in an old amusement park. I glanced at Larsener, gesturing for him to go. I'll remain, he said.
He wants to kill you,
I said. And he'll be drawn to you people, Larsener said, folding his arms. I'll be safer hiding in my room up here. Not with the explosives Mizzy left behind. Look, we could use your help. Join us. Change the world. He sniffed and turned away. I felt it like a punch to the gut. David, Cody said, watching the ceiling. Let's move, lad. Teeth clenched. I pulled the end of the rappelling cord from the box at my belt and hooked it onto an empty spike, then threw myself into the hole. I slid down smooth stone in the darkness, trying to contain my frustration. My expectations were foolish, but part of me had still assumed that Larsener would join us for this battle. I'd always intended to speak with him further, but we'd constantly been frantic with some other preparation. Should I have done anything else? Could I have done anything else? If I'd been cleverer or more persuasive, could I have found a way to bring him to our side? My mobile automatically engaged the box at the correct depth, putting resistance on my cord until I slowed, then popped out into a larger chamber, lurching to a stop a mere 2 or 3 feet above the ground. I cut and dropped into an enormous pile of salt and rock dust. I pushed through, getting out of the way of the opening. Mizzy and Megan shined their mobiles about, lighting a series of natural caverns covered with an impressive amount of graffiti. The caverns tended to be low-ceilinged, about 10 feet high, though this wasn't uniform, and connected by tunnels with lots of nooks. It didn't look quite natural, but it was far more organic than the tunnels beneath Nukago. Had Digzone been as mad as the diggers he'd gifted his powers to? Judging by the crazy number of caverns down here, that seemed likely. Abraham came down into the pile of salt next, the Urteach coating one arm. Finally, Cody entered, and he hadn't bothered with a cord. He dropped out of the hole onto a force field that sprang into existence under his feet. "Cody, disengage the powers," I said, and pointed down a turn in the cavern. "Find a spot in that direction and be ready. We won't be able to surprise him with your abilities, but I still want you to be hidden at first. Mizzy, be ready to blow your present up above on my mark." "Larsener?" she asked. "He knows about the blast," I said. "He'll get out of the way." And if he didn't, well, that was purely on his head. I grabbed my mobile and scrambled across the cavern's uneven floor to a side passage. The complex was intricate, but my mobile's map noted a few relatively safe nooks from which I could run ops. This wasn't the exact side of the cavern complex where we'd originally planned to pull our trap, but it had to work. Megan joined me. "Nice job with the Scotsman up there." "He just needed a little nudge," I said, "to become what he always pretends to be." "He's not the only one," she said. We stopped at an intersection of tunnels, and she pulled me close for a quick kiss. "You always thought you wanted to be in charge, David. You had good reason." She turned to go the other direction. I held her arm, then hand, as she slipped away from me. "Don't push yourself too hard, Megan." She smiled. Sparks, what a smile. And held on to my fingers with hers. "I own it, David. It's mine. I don't fear it anymore. If it takes me, I'll find a way back." She let go, crossing the cavern as I ducked into my chosen nook. It was a tight squeeze, requiring me to wriggle through some rock, but would shelter the light of my mobile from Prof's eyes, and shelter me from explosions. Inside, I was in a small bubble of a room with no other exits. I reached to my belt and detached a headset with a dome of glass attached to its front. A grudging gift from Nighthawk in the same shipment as the tensor suit. Multiple screens could be projected onto it. "Mizzy," I said. "Cameras in place?" "Stick in the last one," she said. "Nighthawk, these things are way creepy."
She says to the man who built them using a mannequin he controls with his mind,
Abraham added under his breath. "Shut it," Nighthawk said, though his voice was somewhat difficult to make out over noise on his end. "Nighthawk," I said, "your line has some kind of static or interference on it." "Oh, don't worry. The popcorn is almost done."
"You're making popcorn?"
Abraham demanded.
"Sure, why not? Should be quite the show."
One by one, 4 screens blinked on my headset's display, giving me a sequence of views of the main cavern and its nearby tunnels. Mizzy had set out glow sticks, though the cameras had thermal and night vision. These things had come from Nighthawk, little crab-like drones with cameras in their bodies. I used my mobile to turn the camera of one drone, and it worked perfectly.
"Nice,"
Nighthawk said. He and Mizzy would be watching the screens also, though Mizzy would be busy with her explosives. Megan and I had been desperate when we'd faced our weaknesses. I hoped that if we could drive Prof to exhaustion, if we presented a real danger, we'd make it easier for him to do the same. "Nighthawk," I said, cycling through the cameras to get a view from Cody's eyes, then Megan's. "Prof's ETA?"
"Just landed on your building,"
he said. "Any other epics with him?"
"Negative,"
Nighthawk said.
"All right, he's vaporized the roof and he's dropping through."
"Mizzy," I said, "blow the present." We felt the shock of it, and some debris rolled down the hole we'd made. I waited, tense, trying to watch all of the different screens at once. Which direction would he come from? The roof of the cave trembled, then fell in, dumping practically a ton of salt dust into the main chamber. Light shone down in streaks. Prof wasn't content with a little hole like we'd made. He'd ripped the top off an entire cavern. He floated down on a glowing disk of light, dust swirling around him, goggles on his face and his dark lab coat fluttering. My breath caught. I didn't see a monster. In my mind's eye, I remembered a man who had come down through another roof amid falling dust. A man who had run for all he had, breaking through to face an enforcement team, risking his life and his own sanity to save me. It was time to return the favor. Go, I whispered over the line. 42. Abraham engaged him first, bringing out the big gun, his gravitonic minigun. I always got a little thrill when I watched it fire because, man, it could unload bullets faster than a pair of drunk hicks visiting a varmint factory. Everyone stay under cover, I warned as Abraham's gun flashed from the darkness, spraying Prof with a couple hundred rounds. Prof's force fields were up and the bullets deflected, but those force fields weren't invincible. Using them took effort. We could wear him down. He sneered at Abraham, then flung his hand to the side, forming his trademark force field globe around the Canadian man. Prof clenched his fist to shrink it, but the force field caught as Abraham used the Urteach to brace it on either side. I had a good view of Prof's startled face through one camera. Cody, go, I said. A flash of light shot from the shadows, and the force field around Abraham shattered. Good. As before, the tensor could negate force fields, though we had to be careful not to vaporize Abraham's gun as a byproduct. Prof roared and pointed at Cody, though nothing seemed to happen. I frowned at the gesture, but didn't have time to think on it as Cody and Abraham engaged Prof. Cody wasn't practiced with force fields. While perhaps trying to throw a globe around Prof, he instead made a wall between them. That accidentally protected him, as Prof sent spears of light Cody's way. They slammed into the wall, piercing it and getting stuck. Abraham, wind around to his left, I instructed. Roared and pointed at Cody, his fist to shrink it, but the force field caught as Abraham used the Urteach to brace it on either side. I had a good view of Prof's startled face through one camera. Cody, go, I said. A flash of light shot from the shadows, and the force field around Abraham shattered. Good. As before, the tensor could negate force fields, though we had to be careful not to vaporize Abraham's gun as a byproduct. Prof roared and pointed at Cody, though nothing seemed to happen. I frowned at the gesture, but didn't have time to think on it as Cody and Abraham engaged Prof. Cody wasn't practiced with force fields. While perhaps trying to throw a globe around Prof, he instead made a wall between them. That accidentally protected him, as Prof sent spears of light Cody's way. They slammed into the wall, piercing it and getting stuck. Abraham, wind around to his left, I instructed. A blip appeared on my map of the caverns, a location where Mizzy had set up a pack of explosives. Megan, see if you can draw him down that tunnel to the right, toward Mizzy's surprise. Roger, Megan said. My little cubby of a cave shook as Prof and Cody clashed, tensor blasts vaporizing one another's force fields. Abraham held his own with the Urteach, forming it into a shield and catching spears of light. Cody wasn't very useful with his own force fields, unfortunately. A few hours of practice did not an expert make. However, he did have tons of practice with the tensors from back in the day, and he was able to work those easily. He kept vaporizing Prof's force fields, protecting himself and, most importantly, Abraham. Cody's suit had a harm's way attached to it, but Abraham didn't have such a blessing. I directed the team as best I could, and for once I didn't have time to wish I were with them. I was too busy leading the team to push Prof toward the set explosions. We blasted him several times, staggering him and keeping him from bringing down Cody and Abraham. I also kept watch on Prof as he occasionally ducked through caverns at a run, trying to loop around and gain an advantage. On my mark, Megan entered the fray, creating illusory versions of herself and Firefight to draw Prof's attention and his attacks. So long as she didn't push too hard, these would just be shadows from other dimensions, like the false faces we'd worn. It wouldn't put anyone in any other dimension in danger, and hopefully wouldn't risk her sanity. Only shadows and feints, anything to keep Prof distracted and off balance. I watched all of this with a sinking feeling. The longer they fought, the more obvious it became that Cody's powers, though aligned more closely with Prof's own abilities than even Tavi's had been, would not immediately force Prof to change. I zoomed my cameras in on Prof's face, watching his expressions. His sneers and condescension soon gave way to a look of fierce determination. In that, I saw the man I knew. Face it, Prof, I thought, huddled in my cocoon of stone, snapping orders and directing cameras. Come on! Why wasn't it enough? Why wouldn't his powers give way before his fears? Megan, Cody, I said. I want to try something. The tensors disrupt his force fields, even the ones protecting his skin. Find a way to catch him in a blast of tensor power, Cody. Then, Megan, I want you to shoot him. Roger, Megan said. Do you care where I hit him? No, I said. His powers are strong enough that he should be able to heal from anything a handgun can dish out. I paused. But maybe make the first hit or two someplace non-lethal just in case. Roger, they said as one. Cody was panting. Hitting him with the tensor is going to be tough, lad. He's been trying to do the same to us, to melt my motivators away. We've been keeping our distance. I focused a camera on him. Seemed like using the tensor suit was exhausting. He and Megan maneuvered into position while Mizzy set up some more explosives farther down the corridor. We'll have to risk it, I said. Ah! Cody interrupted. What the? Cody? I asked. He didn't seem hurt, but he'd stumbled back against the cavern wall and had managed to surround himself with a box of glowing green force fields. Was that a squirrel? He said. It was running across me. A bloody squirrel? What are you talking about? Mizzy asked. Cody seemed confused. Maybe it was a rat or something. I didn't get a good look. I frowned as he dismissed his force fields and ran to join Abraham, who had moved in close to Prof after forming the Urteach into a gauntlet covered in spikes. Nighthawk, Mizzy, I said, did either of you happen to see that thing? Whatever it was that was attacking Cody? I saw a blur, Nighthawk said. I'm rewinding the footage now. I'll send you a still if I spot something. Prof pushed past Abraham, leaving him tripping over a force field rod created right before his legs. Prof slammed his hand to the floor of the cavern and vaporized it in a large swath, dumping Cody into a river of dust. Cody stumbled, slowing down. Prof summoned a spike of light in each hand and shot them across the room, pounding them into Cody's shoulders. Cody screamed and fell into the dust. Sparks. It was obvious who knew these powers better. Megan, I cried. On it, she said, and the ceiling of the cavern rumbled and collapsed, making Prof jump back in alarm. Merely a shadow of another world, but hopefully it would buy Cody enough time to heal. Prof started speaking into a mobile, Nighthawk said, surprised. He must know we're monitoring his line. Sparks, he's talking to you, I think. Patch it through to me, I said. But don't let him hear what we're saying. Think to beat me with my own curse? Prof's familiar voice, gruff and deep, startled me even though I'd been expecting it. I have borne this viper for years, felt it poisoning me day by day. I know it like a man knows his own heartbeat. David, lad, Cody said, coughing. I'm not healing. I felt an icy chill. I focused on Cody, and it was true. He crawled through dust in the trench Prof had made, bleeding from both shoulders, where he'd been struck by light made solid. Why wasn't the harm's way working? Got it, Nighthawk said. Kid, this is trouble. He sent to my screen an image from the camera footage from moments earlier. It showed a blur moving away from Cody, small like a mouse, or a tiny person. Loophole is here, I said over the line. He didn't come alone. Warning, there's another epic in the cavern. I hesitated. Sparks, she unhooked one of the motivators from Cody's vest and ran off with it. Cameras have infrared, Nighthawk said, taking control of several of them. He sounded excited, engaged even. Overlaying now. There! I've got her. Ha! Think you can hide from my all-seeing eyes, little epic? You don't know who you're dealing with. Nighthawk zoomed one of our cameras toward a tiny figure hiding in the shadows near one of the cavern's many broken chunks of rock. She wore jeans, goggles, and a tight shirt. I didn't spot the motivator, but she'd likely shrunk it to a size small enough to carry. "Megan," I said, as Prof rounded the false cave-in. "You and Abraham are going to have to handle him on your own for a time. Keep him distracted. He's going to try to finish off Cody. Mizzy, go help get Cody bandaged. Don't let him bleed out." A series of Rogers sounded. I started wriggling out of my stone confines.
Should have known,
Nighthawk said over the line.
Of course Jonathan came with a plan. He may not have realized I used multiple motivators on this version of the suit, though, so his orders to Loophole weren't complete enough.
"I need you to run ops, Nighthawk."
"Fine,"
he said, reluctant.
"You're going to take on the mini-epic by yourself?"
I squeezed out of my cubby and rolled to my feet. Gottschalk to my shoulder. "She's not a high epic. A single bullet will kill her."
"Yeah, hit her with a bullet the same size as she is. I'm sure that won't harm the motivator she's carrying."
I grimaced as I crept down the hallway. It was a valid point. "Keep an eye on her for me."
"Already done. One of the cameras is set to auto-track her. Jonathan's talking again."
"Patch him through to me, but not the others. I don't want them distracted. And Nighthawk, keep them alive for me, please."
"I'll try. Get that motivator, kid. Fast."
43. I didn't want to be here. I had to listen to Prof as I crept back up the tunnel, lit by the sickly green light of glow sticks.
I wanted to remain quiet,
Prof continued, grunting as he fought.
I didn't want to push myself or my teams too hard. This is your fault, David. Everything that happens here is because of you.
I couldn't see the battle. I still wore the domed headset, but my task was now Loophole and that motivator. I had one screen fixed on the map of the cavern pinpointed. Another showed the view from the camera watching her. They hovered at the edges of my vision. I needed the area right in front of my eyes clear. I walked carefully, as if preparing to join the battle with Prof. I didn't want to alert Loophole.
Tia,
Prof whispered.
You drove me to this, David. You and your idiot dreams. You upset the balance. You should have accepted that I was right.
I gritted my teeth, face flushing. I couldn't let him get to me. But his words were dangerous for reasons he likely didn't know. Last time I'd been in a fight, back in Sharp Tower, things had happened. Something lurked inside me. And so, while Prof's belittling voice in my ears was abrasive, Larsener's taunts from the rooftop earlier were what truly dug into me. You see the truth of men manifest in those first moments, David. New epics. They murder, they destroy, showing what every man would do if his inhibitions were relaxed. Men are a race of monsters, inefficiently chained. Loophole. I had to focus on Loophole. She was the problem right now. What could she do? She had slightly augmented speed and could alter the size of things, herself included. She had to touch them first, though. Her size manipulation lasted a few minutes if left unchecked. She couldn't do it permanently, but she could shrink something and leave it. It would return to normal on its own later, or if she touched it and changed its size again. Fortunately, unlike other similar epics, when she shrank, she didn't retain her strength or mass. She was fast, clever, and dangerous, but not a high epic. And her weakness? I strained trying to remember. Her weakness was sneezing. Her powers disappeared if she sneezed. I had explicit records of that. Well, just because she wasn't a high epic didn't mean she wasn't dangerous. I reached the part of the corridor where she was hiding, then continued down it toward the others, pretending I didn't know she was there. Light shone down from the hole Prof had made in the ceiling. I grabbed a handful of rock dust off the ground, shoving it into my pocket. Distant crashes and shouts echoed from ahead. I resisted the urge to switch camera views and check in.
And where are you, David?
Prof said in my ear.
You let the others die fighting me, but you hide? I never would have figured you for a coward.
On the screen hovering to my right, Loophole was beside her rock, waiting with her back pressed against it. She didn't seem concerned. She was a mercenary, known for giving her loyalty to whichever powerful epic paid her. Prof had likely hired her only to steal the motivator. She'd want nothing else to do with this fight. Too bad for her. Go! I leaped toward the rock where she was hiding, shoving it against the wall of the cavern, hoping to pinch her in place. Halfway through my push, the rock vanished, shrinking to the size of a pebble. I hit the ground, scrambling to grab the tiny figure as it sprinted away. I got a hold of her, but immediately felt a lurching jolt. Loophole was my size again, but she was halfway down the tunnel from me. Why was the tunnel so much larger now? Oh, didgeridoo, I thought. She shrank me. I scrambled to my feet between pebbles that were now the size of boulders. In front of me, a small crack in the floor had become a chasm. Though, granted, it was only about twice as deep as I was tall. I'd been shrunk, as had everything I'd been holding. Loophole, also tiny, had gotten a good 50 feet in front of me, or at least what seemed 50 feet at my current size. Her augmented speed let her run quickly, but it wasn't true super speed, just a little edge on a regular person. That meant she couldn't outrun bullets or anything like that. I unslung my tiny Gottschalk, took aim, and released a burst, intentionally missing. I could still easily pierce the motivator, effectively killing Cody. I'd take that chance if she didn't stop, but a warning shot seemed appropriate. "I've got you, Loophole," I shouted to her. "Give me the motivator and leave. You don't care about this fight, and I don't care about you." She stopped in the corridor and glanced at me, then grew to normal size. Uh-oh. She came stomping toward me, each footfall shaking the floor like an earthquake. I yelped and threw myself into the nearby crack, sliding down onto a ledge as Loophole loomed overhead. She reached down for me, and I unloaded with the Gottschalk. Apparently, even a tiny gun on full auto doesn't feel good. She pulled her fingers back and cursed, a sound like a thunderstorm. Bits of rock dust tumbled into my chasm, falling like a shower of hail. I reached in my pocket and pulled out some of the dust I'd grabbed earlier. It had shrunk with me. I had to get it into her face. Great. It would be like climbing Everest to get up there. Also, noses look really strange from below. I did notice a small pouch hanging from a strap around her neck. The motivator, maybe? She came at me with a knife next, jabbing it into the crack. I grabbed hold of the back of it with one hand, letting the Gottschalk hang from my shoulder by its strap. I was able to ride the knife out as she lifted it, but my plans of climbing up her arm were ruined as she shook the knife, dropping me some 20 feet to the floor. I braced myself and hit, but it didn't hurt much. Huh. Being little had its advantages. I rolled to my feet as she stomped at me. I barely avoided being squished by a footfall. Blast. I'd lost my handful of dust in the fall. In fact, I sneezed and thumped my head against the wall of the cavern as I crashed up against it. I'd increased in size again. Loophole and I regarded one another with similar expressions of shock. "Sneezing works on either of us, eh?" I said. "Nice to know." She growled, reaching for the holster at her side and the handgun there. I kicked it from her grip as soon as she got it free, then slung the Gottschalk around. "Sure you don't want to give me the motivator?" She reached for me. So reluctantly, I fired. Each bullet, as it hit her, shrank to the size of a gnat. They still seemed to hurt, judging by her winces, but they certainly didn't do the whole killing you dead thing I'd been hoping for. She had a hold on the rifle a second later, and it vanished in my hands, shrinking to minuscule size and falling off its strap. I gaped at Loophole. She'd shrunk bullets as they were hitting her. "That was awesome," I said. She decked me, knocking my head against the wall of the cavern again and smashing my headset. I cursed, kicking at her, then scrambled to my feet. "Seriously," I said to Loophole, "I might have to reevaluate. You could be a high epic after all." "What is wrong with you?" she asked, coming at me swinging. I brought my hands up and managed to block. Unfortunately, my return jab at her missed, and she clocked me across the face a second time. Sparks. When she came in again, I grabbed hold of her, as Abraham had taught me. I was bigger, so grappling seemed smart. She shrank my shirt. It just about strangled me, but fortunately it ripped before doing that. I still let go of the woman, gasping. Loophole slammed her hand into my chest, and I grew to 20 feet tall, smashing my head into the roof of the cavern. "David!" Mizzy said over the line. "Hurry, he's in a bad way." "Trying," I croaked as Loophole shrank me down to normal size, then punched me in the face again. The cavern shook and rattled, chips of rock falling from the ceiling, and shouts came from the direction of Prof, Megan, and Abraham. I stumbled away from Loophole, then brought up my arms to block, my hand-to-hand training, and my brain kind of fuzzy at the moment. Her flurry of punches backed me against the wall, where she continued to quite liberally beat on my face, then stomach in turn. I had one chance to reach for my handgun, which I wore strapped to my leg, but she knocked it out of my grasp. She seemed to have grown a few inches, and she towered over me. As my gun clattered away, the only thing I could think to do was jump for her and throw my weight against her, which worked well enough, in that it tumbled us both to the ground. She got up first. I was pretty dizzy, my shirt in tatters. I groaned, rolling over, and found her picking up her fallen handgun. Something dropped from the ceiling onto her back. A mechanical crab? Another one jumped at her from the side, then a third fell from above. They didn't look particularly dangerous, but they startled her, causing her to spin around and grab at her back. The breather was a lifesaver for me, giving me enough time to stop the room from spinning. I dug in my pocket, getting out some more dust. Guns wouldn't work on her. I'd have to be cleverer. "Thanks, Nighthawk," I mumbled, as Loophole shrank to get out of the grip of the crabs. I reached for her, and, like before, she shrank me as soon as I touched her tiny form. I was ready for it this time, and lunged for her as soon as I was tiny. I crashed into her again, grabbing at the pouch around her neck. I felt the thin metal rectangle through the leather inside. The motivator. "Persistent little idiot, aren't you?" she growled at me, as the two of us, still tiny, grappled across the floor. I grunted, managing to roll us up beside the crack chasm in the ground. Then, she headbutted me, and it stung. The room shook, and I gasped, letting go of both her and the pouch. She rose, standing before me, the crack in the ground behind her. "I know his plan," she said. "Epic of all epics. Sounds like a great deal to me. I let him gather the pieces, then I make off with them. Go up and pay a visit to old Calamity myself." I looked up at her, dazed, my nose bleeding. I said, gasping. "Yes?" I panted. "I suppose this would be an awkward time to ask for an autograph." "What?" I threw the dust into her face. Then, as she cursed, I slammed my shoulder into her, grabbing the pouch while simultaneously knocking her backward. The cord snapped, leaving the pouch in my fingers. She fell into the chasm crack, and I rocked there on the edge, almost following her in. She dropped to the bottom, where she hit with a soft thump. "You idiot!" she called up. "You realize that at this size—" She stopped, sniffling for a second. "At this size, a fall isn't harmful at all. You could fall off a building and... Oh, hell!" I jumped away from the crack. A very faint sneeze came from behind, followed by a gut-wrenching splat. I winced, peeking at the mess of pulped flesh and broken bones that Loophole had become by growing too quickly inside far too small a space.
Oof.
Parts of her burbled out the top of the crack like
Oof.
rising dough that had outgrown its bowl. I swallowed, nauseous, then stumbled to my feet and pulled the motivator from the pouch. A bit of dust and one sneeze later, both it and I were back to regular size, though my Gottschalk was nowhere to be found. I grabbed my handgun instead. "Mizzy, I've got the motivator," I said over the line. "Where are you?" 44. I stumbled through the caverns underneath Ildithia, passing walls blasted open with the tensors, leaving scattered piles of sand. The glow sticks gave the tunnels a radioactive cast. I stopped, steadying myself during another tremor, then continued toward the nook where Mizzy had dragged Cody. Was that them ahead? No. I pulled up short. Light poured through a rent in the air, like cut flesh where the skin had curled to the sides. Through it, I saw another cavern, this one lit by a lively orange light. Inside, firefight struggled against loophole. I gaped, watching the woman I'd just killed shrink and run from him while causing a set of falling rock chips to become boulders. Firefight zipped backward, his flames heating the rocks to a reddish orange. I looked down the passage and glimpsed other rents in the air. Megan had been pushing herself, it seemed. I gulped and continued toward Mizzy. A flash of light to my left illuminated figures struggling in the shadows, a section of the cavern network beyond where Mizzy had placed her glow sticks. Prof suddenly appeared a little ways down the cavern, forming like light coalescing. He was using obliteration's powers to teleport. Sparks! Even as he appeared, a section of the roof collapsed. Not an illusion this time, an actual rockfall, which Prof was forced to catch with a force field above his head. He bellowed with rage, holding up the fallen rocks, then sent a few lances of light off into the distance. They'd both been forced, it seemed, to grasp for dangerous resources. Prof using his hidden teleportation device, Megan reaching further and further into other realities. How far had she gone? What if I lost her, as I'd lost Prof? Steady, I thought at myself. She'd been certain she could handle it. I had to trust her. I ducked my head and scrambled down a side tunnel, eventually spotting bloodstains on the stones. I rounded another corner, then stumbled to a halt as I almost tripped over Mizzy and Cody. He lay on the ground with eyes closed, his face pale. Mizzy had needed to pull off most of the tensor suit to get at his wounds. It was piled in a heap nearby, the harm's way portion detached, but with wires extended to his arm. Mizzy yelped when she saw me, then snatched the motivator from my limp fingers. She plugged it back into the vest. Nighthawk, I said over the line. You really need to secure those motivators better. It's a prototype, he grumbled. I built it to have quick access so I could tweak motivators as needed. How was I to know Jonathan would yank the things out? Mizzy glanced at me as the harm's way glowed softly. Sparks, David! You look like you fell off a cliff or something. I wiped my nose, which was still bleeding. My face was starting to swell from the beating I'd taken. I slumped down next to Mizzy, exhausted. How's the fight going? Your girlfriend is kinda amazing, Mizzy said grudgingly. Abraham keeps getting locked up in force fields, but she gets him out. Together they're keeping Prof busy. Does she seem crazy? Mizzy said. Can't tell. She looked to Cody, whose wounds were blessedly closing. He'll be out for a while yet. Hope the other two can last. I'm out of boom packs too, I'm afraid. So maybe... Someone exploded into existence next to us. A sudden burst of light. Silent, but stunning if you watched it. I shouted, falling backward, and reached for the handgun strapped to my leg. It wasn't Prof. Unfortunately, that left only one other option. Obliteration turned, his trench coat sweeping the side of the cavern. He looked from Mizzy to Cody to me, studying us with bespectacled eyes.
I've been summoned, he said.
Yeah, I said, hands trembling as I held my gun on him. Prof, he has a motivator built from your flesh.
To destroy the city?
Obliteration asked, head cocked.
She made a bomb beyond those she gave me.
Those she gave you? I asked. So, you do have more?
Of course, Obliteration said calmly. You are fallen, David Charleston.
He shook his head, then disappeared. leaving behind an image made of ceramic that broke apart and faded. I relaxed. Then Obliteration appeared beside me, hand on my gun. It was suddenly hot, and I shouted, fingers singeing as I dropped the weapon. Obliteration kicked it aside, kneeling next to me.
And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come,
he whispered. He flinched as distantly. Prof must have teleported. Then he grinned, closing his eyes. Sparks! He seemed to like the feeling.
The hour has come for you to die, and for this city to be destroyed. I regret that I cannot give you more time.
He placed his hand against my forehead, and I felt warmth coming from his skin. I'm going to kill Calamity, I blurted out. Obliteration opened his eyes. The heat dampened.
What did you say?
Calamity, I said. He's an epic, and he's behind all of this. I can kill him. If you want to bring about Armageddon, wouldn't that be the perfect way? Destroy this terrible, angel? Creature? Spirit? That sounded religious, right?
He is far away, little man,
Obliteration said, contemplative.
You will never reach him.
You can teleport there, though, right?
Impossible. Calamity is too distant for me to form a proper picture of its location in my mind, and I cannot go to a place I haven't seen or cannot visualize.
How did you get in here, then? Sparks. Had he been watching us somehow? That didn't matter. Hand still trembling, I reached into my pocket and unhooked my mobile. I brought it out and turned to him, displaying Regalia's image of Calamity. What if you have a picture? Obliteration whispered softly, eyes wide.
And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition.
This dude's so crazy.
Again you surprise me. If you defeat your former master and impress me in so doing, I will grant your desires.
He exploded into a flash again, and this time he didn't immediately return. I groaned, leaning against the wall, shaking my burned hand. Calamity, what is up with that man? Mizzy asked, sliding her sidearm into its holster. It took her 3 tries. Her hand was trembling so much. I thought we were dead. Yeah, I said. I half expected him to murder me for the audacity of claiming I wanted to kill Calamity. I figured it was even odds that he worshipped the thing instead of hating it. I peeked around the corner, looking down a tunnel that shone with rents and rips into other dimensions. Abraham just went down, Nighthawk said in my ear. Repeat, Abraham is down. Jonathan sheared his arm off, or Teach attached, with a force field. Sparks, I said. Megan? Hard to see, Nighthawk said. I've only got 2 crab cameras left. I think you're losing this fight, guys. We were losing it before we started, I said, turning and crawling to the tensor suit. Mizzy, some help? She looked at the suit, then at me, eyes widening. She scrambled over, then helped me start putting it on. Cody should be stable now. That harm's way is something. Unhook it and attach it back to the tensor suit, I said. Nighthawk, how much can your drones lift? About 100 pounds each, he said. I work them in tandem for heavier things. Why? Bring some down, grab Cody, pull him out. Is Abraham still alive? Don't know, Nighthawk said. His mobile is still on him, though, so I can show you his location. I looked at Mizzy, and she nodded, plugging the wires from the harm's way into the vest of the tensor suit, which I was now wearing. I'll find him, she said, and stabilize him until you can get back with this. Get the drones hooked to Cody first. Assuming I can get drones into you, Nighthawk said. Jonathan's military has the place surrounded up above. They don't seem too eager to come down and join the fight. And get between 2 high epics, I said. They'll stay back unless directly ordered. They know what happened to the soldiers at Sharp Tower. I'm surprised he was able to get even Loophole to come down here after that. Yeah, Mizzy said. She looked overwhelmed, hands still trembling. I didn't feel much better myself, though with the jolt, I felt the harm's way engage. My pains faded. Get out of here, Mizzy, I said. You've done what you can. Try to get Abraham and Cody to safety. I'll bring the harm's way for Abraham as soon as I can. If I don't make it, set up with Nighthawk. She nodded. Good luck, David. I'm glad I didn't shoot you in Babalar. I smiled, yanking on first the right tensor glove, then the left. You going to be able to make it work? Mizzy asked. Without practice? The lights on the gloves lit up a deep green. I felt their hum course through me, a distant melody that had once been precious to me, yet one I'd somehow forgotten. I released it, reducing the stone wall nearby to a wave of dust. Feels like coming home, I said. In fact, I felt almost good enough to face a high epic. 45. I sprinted through the tunnel, passing shimmering rips on either side, windows to other worlds. Several were to Firefight's realm, but others, fainter, misty, and less distinct, looked farther away. There were worlds where unfamiliar figures fought in these tunnels, or where the place was completely dark, and even worlds where there were no tunnels here, just rock. The tensors hummed on my hands, eager. It was as if the powers themselves knew I was trying to save Prof. They sang me a battle hymn. As I reached the chamber where I'd seen Prof earlier, I let out a burst of vibrating energy, dispelling the rock of a ledge before me, creating a set of dust-covered steps that I strode down. Prof glowed green in the center of the chamber. The sleeves of his coat rolled back to expose forearms covered with dark hair. He turned on me, then laughed.
David Charleston,
he said, his voice booming in the chamber.
Steel Slayer, come to finally take responsibility for what you began in New Cago? Have you come to pay?
The floor here was pocked with tensor holes, and those alternated with piles of rubble and dust that had collapsed from the ceiling. Sparks! This place was a few breaths and a modest bass beat away from a cave-in. I stepped up before him, hoping I could make the suit's force fields work. Where was Megan? She'd be reborn if she'd died, so that didn't worry me as much as the existence of all these tears in reality. One of them hovered nearby, darkness visible only because of the shimmering at its sides. Megan stepped out of it. I jumped. Sparks, it was her, but a strange version of her. Blurry. Because it's not just one of her, I realized. I wasn't looking at one Megan, but hundreds, overlapping one another, each similar but somehow individual. A freckle in a different place, hair that parted another way, eyes too pale here or too dark there. She smiled at me. 1,000 smiles. I've got Abraham, Mizzy said. He's alive, but it would be real nice if you kept the harm's way safe, David. If you want Abraham back to one piece, at least. Pulling out now. Roger, I said, looking at Prof. His clothing was dusty, ripped. He'd bled and healed from multiple cuts on his face. One hadn't healed, a place where Cody had hit him with the powers somehow. Beleaguered though he was, Prof didn't seem afraid. He stood tall, confident. 4 glowing lances of light appeared around him.
The price, David,
Prof said softly. He released the lances, driving them toward me. I was able to vaporize them with the tensors, which shattered the force fields to tiny specks. They sprayed across me before twinkling away. Not content to get pushed around, I charged Prof, trying to summon force fields of my own. All I got were a few shimmers of green, ripples like light reflecting off a pond. Crud. Prof sent a second set of spikes, but, like Cody, I was familiar enough with the tensors to stop these as well. I leaped over a pit in the ground, then slammed my hand on the floor, opening up a gap with a blasting hum. Prof dropped a mere inch before landing on a disc of green light. He shook his head, then flung his hand toward me, sending a gout of tensor energy that dropped the ground out from beneath me, as I'd done to him. I frantically tried to create a force field to land on, but only got another shimmer of light. Then an instant later, the hole wasn't as deep, and I hit bottom 3 feet down. Megan stood beside the hole. "There are many worlds where he did not dig deep enough with that blast," she said, her voice overlapped by 100 whispers. Prof growled, charging me and summoning spears of light, one after another. I hopped out of the hole, falling in beside Megan, destroying the spikes where I could. Each time I did so, Prof winced. "So, how do we fight him?" Megan asked in overlapping voices. "All I've been able to do is distract him. Is the plan still to make him confront his fears somehow?" "Not sure, honestly," I said, thrusting my hands in front of me and straining. Finally, I produced a force field wall. It was kind of like using the tensors in reverse. Instead of releasing a hum, I let it build up inside me until it coalesced. "How much can you alter?" I asked, looking at Megan. "Little things," she said. "Reasonable things. My powers haven't changed. I just know them. David, I can see worlds. So many worlds." She blinked, an action that seemed to trail infinite shadows of eyelids. "But they're all ones that are nearby. It's amazing, yet frustrating. It's like I can count as many numbers as I want, but only if they happen to be between 0 and 1. Infinity, yet still bounded." Prof shattered our force field, then raised his hands, causing the ceiling to shake. I summoned the tensor powers as I anticipated his move. Indeed, he tried to bring the ceiling down on us by vaporizing a ring of rock, dropping a large stone in the center. I vaporized the chunk right above us. We were showered with dust, and the way it fell on Megan proved she was here, and real, not a shadow, as a piece of me had feared. Prof winced again. "I'm using his power, and it hurts." "All right, I have a plan," I said to Megan. "Which is?" "To run," I said, turning and dashing out of the main chamber into a side tunnel. Megan cursed, following. We ran side by side, and I engaged the tensors, vaporizing ribbons of stone along our path. I wasn't sure what I could do to change him or make him return to us. All of my plans had failed so far. The best thing I could do at the moment was keep the suit working and keep him in pain. Behind us, Prof roared. He teleported in front of us, but I simply grabbed Megan by the hand and turned the other direction while disintegrating the force field Prof tried to use to trip us up. We ran into a tunnel without any light, but glow sticks appeared a second later, summoned by Megan from a realm where Mizzy had lit this place. When Prof teleported in front of us again, red-faced and snarling, I turned us back the other way, unrelentingly using the suit's powers on random stones we passed. Each use of the tensors was driving him further into a fury. I've been here before, I thought, feeling the echoes of another event, another fight, driving an epic to anger. Prof appeared again, and this time Megan reacted first, yanking me to the side as spears of light, faster than I could track, struck like blades around us. Sparks! I barely stopped them. Maybe this wasn't such a good plan.
"This is always how you are," Prof shouted. "No thought, no concern for consequences. Don't you worry about what will happen. Don't you ever think about failure." He teleported in front of us as we tried to flee, but a second later, a rock wall created by Megan separated us.
"This isn't working," she said. "Well, technically it is. I mean, my plan was just to run." "Okay, I revise. This isn't going to work for very long. Sooner or later he'll trap us."
Sorry, good stretch.
"What's your end game?" "Make him mad," I said. "And?" "Hope, That makes him afraid? We were desperate, scared, frantic when we faced our weaknesses. Maybe he has to be in the same state. She gave me a skeptical look that, reflected through all of her shadows, was even more formidable than usual. The wall near us melted away to powder. I gathered the energy of the tensors, preparing to be attacked by a series of force field spears. But Prof wasn't behind the wall anymore. Huh? He crashed into existence behind us and seized me by the arm with one hand. With the other, he tried to vaporize the motivators on my vest. I yelped and let out a blast of tensor power, directly down, carving out the rock beneath me and dropping me lower a few feet. The sudden motion lurched me out of Prof's grip and made his blast pass over my head. I vaporized the ground below him, and by reflex he created a force field to stand on, so I wriggled through the dust underneath him. He had to twist to see me, but that left him open to Megan, who, of course, shot him. It didn't have much effect. He was protected, as always, by thin, invisible force fields around his whole person. Her shots did distract him long enough for me to crawl out from underneath the disc on the other side. There, I raised my handgun and started firing as well. He turned on me, annoyed, and I hit him with a blast of tensor power, dissolving his force fields. Megan's gunshots began to chew chunks out of him, and he cursed, flashing away. Megan stepped up to me, her face blurred by 100 different identities. "We don't have the weakness right, David. His own powers could hurt him," I said, "and the tensor leaves him able to be shot. He heals from those shots immediately," she said. "And getting hit with tensor power doesn't disrupt his abilities as much as it should. It's like we have part of the weakness right, but don't grasp the entire thing. And that's why he's not turning. Confronting the powers must not be enough." I couldn't argue. She was right. I sensed it inside, with a sinking feeling. "So what now?" I asked. "Any ideas?" "We have to kill him." I drew my lips to a line. I wasn't sure we could do that. And even if we could kill him, it felt like in so doing, we might win the battle, but lose the war. Megan glanced at my gun. "You're reloaded, by the way." My gun suddenly felt a bit heavier. "That's convenient." Can't help thinking there should be more I can do than reload guns and replace walls. I can see so much. It's overwhelming. "We need to pick one thing for you to change," I said, holding my gun and watching for Prof to reappear. "Something very useful." "A weapon," she said, nodding. "Abraham's minigun?" She smiled, and that smile became an almost girlish grin. "No, that's thinking too small." "That gun is too small? Woman, I love you." "Actually," she said, turning her head to look at something I couldn't see, "there is a very close world where Abraham ran ops for our team." "What does that have to do with guns? You..." I cut off as the cavern shook. I spun, then stumbled back as the entire wall of the tunnel, dozens of feet along, turned to dust in an incredible burst of power. Prof stood beyond, and he'd been busy. Hundreds of spears of light hovered around him. We'd been talking. He'd been planning. I shouted, thrusting my hand forward and releasing tensor power as the spears came for us. I got the first wave and most of the second, but my blast ran out as the third bore down upon us. They got caught in a reflective, silvery metallic surface that formed a shield in front of us. Megan grunted, holding the mercury steady, blocking the next two waves of impact. "You see?" she said, now bearing the glove that controlled the Urteach. "In a world where Abraham leads the team, someone else has to learn to use this." She grinned, then grunted at another impact. "So, we going to bring him down?" I nodded, feeling sick. "At the very least, we need him afraid. That's the path that led us to change. We were terrified, facing death. Only when we were in serious danger did confronting our fears work. It felt wrong, like I was still missing something. But in the chaos of the moment, it was the best I could do. "Time to be a little brash," she said, holding out the Urteach in one hand, gun in the other. "Foolhardy," I agreed, hefting my own gun. "Reckless." I nodded to her, took a deep breath, and we attacked. Megan lowered her shield, letting the Urteach crawl back up her arm. I sent out another wave of tensor power, and we ran through it, firing like madmen. The guns seemed mundane compared to the deific powers spinning about us, but they were familiar, dependable, solid. We interrupted Prof in the middle of raising another wave of light spears. His eyes widened and his jaw lowered, as if he was befuddled to see the two of us coming right at him. He swept his hand forward, summoning a large force field to block us, but I crashed through it with a tensor burst, and Megan followed. "Fine," he said, pounding his hand into the ground. Rock vaporized around it, and he pulled out a large rod of stone. He stepped forward, slamming it toward Megan, who caught it on her arm with the Urteach. The mercury ran down onto Prof's arm, holding him in place as I arrived to send a burst of tensor power at him, intending to follow it with a few shots to the face. Prof, however, matched my invisible blast with one of his own. They canceled one another out, crashing together with a sound that made my ears pop. I skidded to a halt, then shot him in the face anyway. I mean, it had to be distracting, right? Even if the bullets bounced off. Maybe I could get one stuck in his nose or something. He growled, yanking his fist free of the Urteach and shoving Megan away. He swung his bar toward me, but I managed to vaporize it. Then, I dumped about half a ton of dust on him from the ceiling, making him slip and stumble. When he righted himself, Megan came in with the Urteach, coating her hand, arm, and side to give power, then slammed her fist into his face. Even with the force fields, Prof cursed and stumbled backward. Megan came in, and he vaporized the ground in a deep hole that must have emptied into a cavern far beneath us. But Megan formed the Urteach into a long rod and caught herself with it spanning the hole. I slammed into Prof, shoulder first, sending him skidding through the dust. I knelt, giving Megan a hand, and yanked her out of the hole. Together, we went at him again. She'd apparently reloaded our guns, because I didn't run out of bullets. And when Prof vaporized my gun, she tossed me another one, almost identical, that she'd pulled from an alternate dimension. She was amazing with the Urteach, commanding it along her body like a rippling second skin, blocking, attacking, bracing herself at other times. I kept Prof's footing uneven, and when I could, vaporized his force fields, letting us pound him with bullets. The fight felt strangely perfect for a time. Megan and I working side by side, voicelessly, each anticipating the other's moves. Incredible powers at our disposal, weapons in our hands. Together we forced a much more experienced epic to retreat. For a moment, I let myself believe we would win. Unfortunately, Prof's healing powers kept spitting our bullets out. We weren't negating those, not well enough. Megan shot for his head, not holding back, and I didn't stop her. But that attack failed like the others. We ended up in one of the main chambers, dust dribbling around us. I withstood an assault by Prof's spears, grunting as one stabbed me in the shoulder. My motivator-aided healing powers let me recover. Megan stepped in, shielding me, but judging by the sweat dripping down her face, she was wearing down. I felt it too. Using the powers like this was taxing. We braced ourselves, waiting for another attack from Prof. My gun clicked as Megan reloaded it, and I looked to her. "Another attack?" she whispered. I wasn't sure anymore. I tried to force out a reply, but then the ceiling caved in on us. I stumbled, looking up, but Megan managed to turn the Urteach to stop the sudden torrent of stone and dust. Garish sunlight streamed down out of the hole Prof had made, as wide as the entire cavern. I blinked, unaccustomed to the light, and looked at Prof, who had stepped out of the way of the downpour and now stood under the lip in shadow. "Fire," he said. Only then did I notice that surrounding the perfect hole about 30 feet above was a squadron of 50 men and women. They carried flamethrowers. 46. Flames rained down toward us. They'd been prepared for this. We hadn't been forcing Prof to retreat. He'd been leading us by the nose. The Orteach vanished as the flames surrounded us. Megan's images and shadows all snapped together, and there was suddenly one crisp version of her, lit by firelight. She threw herself to the ground as the sheets of flame fell. "No!" I screamed, thrusting my hand toward her, my glove flashing. I couldn't afford to be bad at force fields, not now. I strained, like I was stretching to carry too heavy a weight. Blessedly, a glowing protective dome appeared around Megan, blocking the flames. She pressed her hands against the shield I'd created, eyes wide as the entire thing was bathed in fire. I stumbled back from the heat, my hand in front of my face. The fires got awfully close, but the burns I took healed. Up above, men and women began firing automatic weapons. I screamed, releasing the tensor power and vaporizing the weapons in a wave of dust. Guns and flamethrowers crumbled. The gap above widened, raining down salt. And then people, as their footing vanished beneath them. The fires stopped falling, but the damage was done. Pools of liquid flame burned in the now open cavern floor, curling black tongues of smoke toward the sky. It was so hot, sweat beaded on my forehead. Megan's powers would be worthless in here. I blinked against the dust and smoke as Prof emerged from the shadows, grim, bloodied, but still not afraid. Sparks, still not afraid.
Did you think I wouldn't have a plan? He said to me softly. Did you think I wouldn't prepare for Megan and her powers?
His feet ground against salt dust as he walked past a groaning soldier.
That's what you forget, David. A wise man always has a plan.
Sometimes the plans don't work, I snapped. Sometimes careful preparation isn't enough.
And so you storm in, taking no care?
He shouted, startlingly angry.
Sometimes you just have to act, Prof. Sometimes you don't know what you need until you're in the thick of it. That doesn't give you an excuse to upend another man's life. Doesn't give you an excuse to ignore everyone else to follow your own stupid passions. Doesn't excuse your complete lack of control.
I roared, building a crescendo of tensor power. I didn't aim it toward the ground or the walls. I hurled it toward him. A charge of raw power. A vessel for my frustration, my anger. Nothing was working. Everything was falling apart. It hit him, and he leaned back as if struck by something physical. Buttons on his shirt disintegrated. Then Prof yelled and sent a blast of tensor power at me in return. I hit it with my own. The two slammed against one another like discordant sounds, and the cavern shook, stone rippling as if it were made of water. Vibrations washed over me. The gun in my hand crumbled to dust, as did the tensor glove on the hand holding it. But the blast didn't reach the rest of me. Still, the shock of it knocked me off my feet. I groaned and rolled over. Prof was there, looming above me. He reached down and grabbed the 3 boxes on the front of my vest, ripping them free of the fabric, removing the motivators from the tensor suit.
These,
he said,
belong to me.
No. He backhanded me, a powerful blow that sent me sprawling across the rock and dust. I came to rest near Megan, who was out of her protective dome. I was no longer holding the power to maintain it. She stood in the firelight, raised her gun in 2 hands, and shot at Prof. A meaningless popping. Prof didn't even seem to care. I lay there with my arm buried in the mottled dust of the floor.
You're fools,
Prof said, tossing the motivators aside.
Both of you.
Better a fool than a coward, I hissed. At least I've tried to do something. Tried to change things.
You've tried, and you've failed, David,
Prof said, stepping forward as Megan ran out of bullets. I could hear the anguish in his voice.
Look at you! You couldn't defeat me! You failed!
I rose to my knees, then settled back, feeling suddenly drained. Megan sank down beside me, burned, exhausted. Perhaps it was the lack of the harm's way to prop me up. Perhaps it was the knowledge that at last we were done. But I didn't have the energy to rise. I barely had the energy to speak. We've been beaten, yes, Megan said. But we haven't failed, Jonathan. Failure is refusing to fight. Failure is remaining quiet and hoping someone else will fix the problem. I met his eyes. He stood about 5 feet before us in a cavern, which was now more of a crater. Ildithia's creeping salt crystals had begun to crawl over the rim of the hole, crusting over the sides. If other soldiers were up there, they'd wisely taken cover. Prof's face was a network of cuts, injuries from debris blown by our violent explosion of tensor power, which had temporarily negated his force fields. As if in defiance of my hopes, those wounds started to heal. Megan was right. Something glimmered in my memories. Refusing to act, I said to Prof. Yes, that's failure, Prof. Like, perhaps, refusing to enter a contest, even though you dearly wanted the prize? He stopped right in front of me. Tia had told me a story about him when we were in Babalar. He'd wanted desperately to visit NASA, but wouldn't enter the contest that might have won him the chance. Yes, I said. You never entered. Were you afraid to lose, Prof? Or were you afraid to win?
How do you know about that?
He demanded with a roar, summoning 100 lines of light around him. Tia told me, I said, climbing to my knees, placing my hand on Megan's shoulder for support. It was starting to click. You've always been like this, haven't you? You founded the Reckoners, but refused to push them too far. Refused to face the most powerful epics. You wanted to help, Prof, but you weren't willing to take the last step. I blinked. You were afraid. The lines around him faded. The powers are part of it, I said, but not the whole story. Why do you fear them? He blinked. Because if you are so powerful, Megan whispered, if you have all of these resources, then you don't have any excuses left for failing. He started weeping, then gritted his teeth and reached for me. You've failed, Prof, I said. The force fields faded, and he stumbled. Tia's dead, Megan added. You failed her.
Shut up!
The wounds on his face stopped healing.
Shut up, both of you!
You killed your team in Babalar, I said. You failed them. He lunged forward and seized me by the shoulders, knocking Megan aside. But he was trembling, tears streaming from his eyes. You were strong, I told him. You have powers no others can match. And still you failed. You failed so deeply, Prof.
I can't have,
he whispered. You did. You know you did. I braced myself in his grip, preparing for the lie I spoke next. We killed Larsener, Prof. You can't complete Regalia's plan. It doesn't matter if I die. You failed. He dropped me. I stumbled up to my feet, but he sank to his knees.
Failed,
he whispered, Blood dripped from his chin.
I was supposed to be a hero. I've had so much power, and I still failed.
Megan limped up beside me, ashen-faced, rubbing her cheek where Prof had hit her. Hell, she whispered. It worked. I looked at Prof. He still wept. But when he turned his face toward me, I saw pure loathing in his eyes. Hatred for me, for this situation, for being made a weak, common mortal. No, I said, my stomach sinking. He didn't face it. We'd found the true weakness. Tia had been wrong. His fear was something deeper than just the powers, though they, and his competence as a whole, were certainly part of that. He was afraid of stepping up, of becoming everything he could be. Not because the powers themselves frightened him, but because if he tried, then the failure was far, far worse. At least if he held something back and failed, he could tell himself it wasn't completely his fault, or that it was part of the plan, that he'd always intended for it to go this way. Only if he gave his all, only if he was using every resource he had, would the failure be complete. What a terrible burden the powers were. I could see how they'd become a focus for him, how they represented the whole of his competence, and how they also represented his potential for true failure. Megan pressed something into my hand. Her gun. I regarded it, then, my arm feeling like lead, I raised it to Prof's head.
Do it,
he growled.
do it, you bastard!
My hand was steady, my aim unwavering, as I rested my finger on the trigger, and remembered. Another day, in a steel room, with a woman I'd driven to rage. Me kneeling on a gridiron battlefield. My father, his back to the bank pillar, in the shadow of a deity. No, I said, turning away. Megan didn't object. She joined me. Together, we walked away from Prof.
Who's the coward now?
He demanded, kneeling in shadows and flickering firelight, weeping.
David Charleston, killer of epics. You're supposed to stop me!
That, a new voice said, can be arranged. I turned, completely astonished, as Larsener strolled from the shadows of a stone overhang nearby. Had he been there all along? It defied reason, but... He reached Prof and lightly rested his fingers on the man's neck. Prof screamed, going stiff. Like ice water in the veins, I'm told, Larsener said. I charged toward them across the open cavern. What are you doing? Ending your problem, Larsener said, holding on to Prof. You wish me to stop? I swallowed. Too late, anyway, Larsener said, pulling his fingers away and inspecting them. He looked into Prof's eyes. Excellent. It worked this time. I did need to check after our little problem with your girlfriend. He looked up at the sky, then glared at the sunlight, stepping back into the shadows. Sparks. The sun was low on the horizon. It had to be at least 5 by now. I hadn't realized we'd been fighting so long. I knelt down beside Prof. He was staring ahead, looking stunned. I prodded him softly, but he didn't move, didn't even blink. It's a good solution, David, Megan said, joining me. It's either this or kill him. I looked into those sightless eyes, and nodded. She was right, but I couldn't help feeling that I'd failed in some monumental way. I'd fought Prof to a halt, figured out his weakness, and negated his powers. Yet he hadn't pushed back the darkness. We could have found another method, right? Kept his weakness engaged until he came to himself. I wanted to weep, but strangely, I felt too tired even for that. Let's go find the others, I said, rising. I pulled off the vest, still with wires attached for the motivators. We'd need to get the harm's way running again to heal Abraham. I set it beside the metal boxes that held the motivators. Then I scanned the sky, hoping to spot one of Nighthawk's drones. A flash of light. Obliteration's hand fell on my shoulder.
Well done, he said. The beast is vanquished. It is time for me to make good on my promise.
We vanished. 47. We appeared on a barren cliff, overlooking a scrub desert with sweltering air that smelled of baked earth. Red rocks peeked from the soil, displaying a variety of strata, like pancakes piled high. Behind me, something glowed brightly. I turned and raised my hand, squinting at it.
A bomb,
Obliteration said.
made of my own flesh. My son, you might say.
You used one of these to destroy Kansas City.
Yes,
He said, subdued.
I cannot travel well when full of energy. I must sun myself in the place I am to destroy. But that creates a conundrum. The more my notoriety grows, the more people flee my presence. And so
you took Regalia's offer. Your flesh in exchange for a weapon.
this one was for Atlanta.
He said, then rested his hand on my shoulder in an almost paternal way.
I give it to you, Steel Slayer, for your hunt. Can you use this to destroy the king above, the epic of epics?
I don't know, I said, eyes watering against the light. Sparks, I was so tired, drained, wrung out like a threadbare dish rag so full of holes it was good for nothing more than propping up the corner of your wobbly kitchen table. But if anything can do it, that will. Even powerful high epics have been known to fall to overwhelming outpourings of energy like nukes, or Obliteration's own destructive force.
I will take you and it to the palace above,
he said.
The New Jerusalem. Detonate the bomb with this.
He handed me a small rod, kind of pen-like, which was startlingly familiar. A universal detonator. I'd had one of these once. Could I maybe do it from down here? I asked. Obliteration laughed.
You ask if you may set aside your cup? Only natural. But no, you must face this in person. I have extended your life to perform this act because I know its result. The detonator has a short range.
I gripped the detonator in a sweaty palm. The death sentence, then. Perhaps the bomb would have been rigged with a timer, but I doubted Obliteration would agree to that. I didn't even get to say goodbye to Megan, I thought, feeling sick. Yet here was the chance I'd insisted I saw. An ending. Can I think about it?
For a short time,
he said, checking the sky.
But not long. He will soon rise, and we cannot let him see what we are planning.
I sat down, trying to clear my mind, trying to recover some strength and confront the opportunity I'd been handed. I tried to sort through it. Prof defeated, but drained of powers. He'd seemed so numb when I'd looked at him, as if he'd been hit by some strong blow to the head. He'd recover, right? Some assumers left their prey stunned, even brain dead, after their powers were taken. Those people recovered when the powers were restored. But Larsener never gave back what he stole. How had I never considered that? Sparks, how had I missed Prof's weakness? His timid planning, the way he looked for excuses to give away his powers and mitigate failures. It all pointed to his fears. All along, he'd been unwilling to fully commit.
Well, Obliteration finally asked, we have no more time.
I didn't feel any more rested, despite the breather. I'll go, I whispered, hoarse. I will do it.
Well chosen.
He led me to the bomb that I assumed had been placed here in this wasteland to gather heat from the sun. I moved closer to it and got a sense of its shape. A metal box about the size of a footlocker. It wasn't hot, though it seemed as if it should be. Obliteration knelt and put one hand on it. The other he placed on my arm.
You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Farewell, Steel Slayer.
My breath caught as I was seized in the flash of light. A second later, I found myself looking down at Earth. I barely heard the crash behind me as Obliteration left, abandoning me. I was in space. I knelt on what appeared to be a surface of glass, looking down at a gloriously stomach-twisting sight. The Earth in its splendor, surrounded by a haze of atmosphere and clouds. So peaceful. From up here, my daily concerns seemed insignificant. I tore my eyes away from that sight to look around, though I had to put my back to the bomb and squint to make anything out over its light. I was in some kind of building or ship with glass walls. I stumbled to my feet, noting the wall's rounded corners and a distant red light somewhere in this glassy structure. Then I realized that despite the fact that I was all the way up in space, my feet remained planted on the surface beneath me. I would have expected to float. The bomb shone like a star behind me. I fingered the detonator. Should I do it now? No, I needed to see him first, up close. He glowed crimson, bright as the bomb, but was somewhere ahead of me in the ship, his light refracting through corners and surfaces of glass. My eyes were gradually adjusting, and I noticed a doorway. I stumbled toward it, as the floor was uneven, lined with ladder-like grips and bars. The walls were also uneven, made of different compartments filled with wires and levers, only it was all glass. I passed through a corridor with difficulty. There was something etched into one wall, and I ran my hand over it. English letters? I could read them. Some kind of company name, it seemed. Sparks. I was in the old International Space Station, but it had been transformed into glass. Feeling an unreal disconnect, I continued toward the light. The glass was so clear, I could almost believe that it wasn't there. I stumbled through room after room, my arm out to make sure I didn't walk into a wall, and the red light grew larger. I eventually stepped into one last room. It was bigger than the others I'd passed through. And Calamity waited on the far side, facing away from me, I thought, though he was so bright it was difficult to make out much about him. Arm raised against the light, I clutched the detonator tighter. I was being stupid. I should have blown the bomb. Calamity might kill me the moment he saw me. Who knew what powers this being had? But I had to know, had to see him with my own eyes. I had to meet the thing that had ruined my world. I walked through the room, Calamity's light dimmed. My breath caught in my throat, and I tasted bile. What would the people below think? Calamity going out? The light lowered to a faint glow, revealing a young man in a simple robe with red glowing skin. He turned to face me, and I knew him.
Because it's himself.
David, Larsener said.
What? Wait, it's Larsener? Wait, what? He's got to be just up there just to say hi. That's all he's got to be up there for. Hold on. No. Is Larsener really going to be the main fucking dude? Oh my god, okay. Of course. Alright. Where is... Alright, be right back. Okay. Need to know what happens. Holy shit.
48. You, I whispered. You were down below. With us all along. Yes, Larsener said, turning to regard the world. I can project the decoy of myself. You know this. You even mentioned the power on several occasions. I reeled, trying to connect it all. He'd been with us. Calamity had been living with us. Why? What?
What the
Larsener
fuck?
sighed, a shockingly human sound. Annoyance. An emotion I'd felt from him quite often. I keep looking at it, he said, trying to find what you see in it. I hesitantly stepped up beside him. The world? It's broken, terrible, horrid. Yeah, I said softly. Beautiful. He looked at me, narrowing his eyes. You're the source of it all, I said, resting my fingers on the glass in front of me. You... all along, the powers you stole from other epics? I simply took back what I once gave, he said. Everyone was so quick to believe in an epic who could steal abilities. They never realized they'd had it backward. I'm no thief. Larsener, they called me. Petty. He shook his head. I swallowed, blinking. Why? I asked Calamity. Please tell me. Why have you done this? He mused, hands clasped behind him. It was Larsener. Not only the same face, but the same mannerisms. The same way he sniffed before speaking, as if forming words to speak with me were beneath him.
You are to destroy yourselves, he said quietly. I am but the harbinger. I bring the powers. You use them and orchestrate your own end. It is what we have done in countless rounds. I'm told.
You're told? By who?
It is a wonderful place,
he said, as if he hadn't heard me.
You wouldn't be able to comprehend it. Peace, softness, no terrible lights, no lights at all. We don't sense with horrid appendages like eyes. We live there as one until our duty arrives. He sneered. And this is mine. So I came here and left it all, and exchanged it for
harsh lights, I said. Loud sounds. The pain of heat, of sensation.
Yes,
he said. Those aren't my nightmares, I said, raising my hand to my head. They're yours. Sparks, they're all yours, aren't they?
Don't be foolish, babbling about your silly notions again.
I stumbled back, catching myself on a boxy protrusion from the wall. I could see it in my nightmares. Visions of being born in this world, a place so foreign to Calamity. To his senses, a terrible place. The harsh lights of my nightmares were no more than common ceiling lights. The clatter and yells? People talking, or the thumps of furniture moving. The terrible nature of it was all in comparison to where he'd lived before. Another place, one I couldn't comprehend, one that lacked such intense stimuli. Were you supposed to leave us? I asked. Calamity didn't reply. Calamity! After you granted our powers, were you supposed to leave?
Why would I remain in this terrible place longer than I had to? He said, dismissive.
In Megan's parallel world, I whispered. There you did leave, and the darkness never claimed the epics. Here, you remained, and you infected us somehow. Your hatred, your loathing. You turned each epic into a copy of you, Calamity. Megan had said that her fear of flames hadn't been nearly as pronounced before her powers arrived. My fear of the depths had started once his eyes turned upon me. Whatever Calamity did, whatever he was, when he wormed his way into someone, he magnified their terrors to an unnatural level. And when people were exposed to those fears, the things he hated, Calamity withdrew. Gone were the powers, and gone was the darkness. Confronting the fears, that worked into it too somehow. It had to. When you confronted your fears, what happened? They are mine, Megan had said. I claim them. Sparks. Did that mean she had seized the powers and cast out Calamity fully? Separated them from the darkness?
You all make so many excuses,
Calamity said.
You refuse to see what your people are once they get a little power.
He looked at me.
What you are, David Charleston. You have hidden it from the others, but you cannot fool the source himself. I know what you are. When will you release it? When will you destroy, as is your destiny?
I never will.
Nonsense. It is your nature. I have seen it over and over again.
He stepped toward me.
How did you do it? How did you hold me off so long?
Is that why you came to us? I asked. In Ildethia? Because of me? Calamity glowered at me. Even now, even seeing him in his glory, I had the same impression of him I'd always had. That of a great spoiled child. Calamity, I said. You have to go. Leave us. He sniffed. I'm not allowed to go until my work is done. They made that clear after I... What? I do not see you answering the questions I gave you, he said, then turned back to look out his window. Why have you denied your powers? I licked my lips, heart thumping. I can't be an epic, I said. My father was waiting for them.
So?
I trailed off. I couldn't voice it.
11 years, and still your kind lingers, Calamity muttered. Dwindling, yes, but also lingering. 10 years as a child I lived among you, until I fled to this place.
That's when Calamity rose, I thought. When he was 10, and when he decided to start giving away powers.
This place,
Calamity said.
which is closer to my home than anything else in this rotten realm. But I found I had to start going down again among you. I had to know, what did you see in all of this? 11 years more, and I haven't been able to find it.
I looked down at the thin detonator rod still clenched in my hand. I had my answers. They raised more questions, true. What was the place he had come from? Why did his kind seek to destroy us? He acted like it was predetermined, but by who and why? Questions I would probably never see answered. My single regret was that I hadn't said goodbye to Megan. I would have liked one last farewell kiss. My name is David Charleston. I clicked the button. And I kill epics. The bomb detonated. 49. The explosion ripped through the glass space station, shattering it to pieces. The heat and force hit me in an instant, then curved around me. It streamed into Calamity's outstretched palm, sucked like water through a straw. It was over in an eye blink. Behind me, the station re-knit itself, glass forming back together, resealing. I stood like an idiot, clicking the button again and again.
You thought, Calamity said without looking at me, that my own power could destroy me. I suppose there would be a poetry to that, but I am master of the powers, David. I know them all in their intricacy. Yes, I could tell you how Ildethia works. Yes, I could explain what Megan does in jumping to other realms, both core possibilities and one's ephemeral. But I am truly immortal. None of the powers could harm me, not permanently.
I sank to the floor. The strain of it all overwhelmed me. The fight with Prof, being stolen away by obliteration, pressing that button and being prepared to die.
I've wondered if I should simply tell them,
Calamity mused, and turned to me.
You should understand that you need to destroy yourselves. But you see, I am not supposed to interfere. Even the small infractions, like being forced to make devices for your assault on Sharp Tower, worry me. It is against our way, though maintaining my cover required it.
Calamity, you're already interfering. Deeply. You make them go mad. You make them destroy. He ignored me. Sparks. How could I get him to see? How could I show him that he was causing the darkness and destruction, that men wouldn't take to it as naturally as he claimed?
You are worthless as a whole,
he said softly.
You will destroy yourselves, and I will bear witness. I will not shirk my duty as others have. We are to watch, as is our calling. I must not interfere, not again. The acts of youth can be forgiven. Though I was never truly a child, I was new, and your world is a shock. A dreadful shock. He nodded, as if convincing himself. I forced myself to stand. Then I slipped my gun from its holster on my leg. Your answer to everything, David Charleston? Calamity said with a sigh.
Worth a try, I said, raising the gun.
I contain the very powers of the universe. Do you understand that? They are all mine. I am what you call a high epic 1,000 times over.
You're a monster either way, I said. Divine powers don't make you a god, I guess. They make you a bully who happens to have the biggest gun. I pulled the trigger. The gun didn't even fire.
I removed the powder,
Calamity noted.
Nothing you can possibly do, whether the result of epic powers or the craftiness of men, can hurt me.
He hesitated.
You, however, have no such protections.
I said. Then I ran.
Really? He asked after me. This is what we're doing?
I tore out of the room, scrambling back the way I'd come, which was tough considering that this place had been made for people who moved in freefall, not people who walked. I reached the room where I'd first arrived. Dead end. Calamity sprang into existence near me. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Non-interference, right?
Of course, David,
Calamity said.
Though you did break the station, I needn't save you from the natural result of your actions. This place can be so fragile.
He smiled. I lunged for a hand grip on the floor. Just in time, as a large hole opened in the side of the room. The wind howled.
Goodbye, David Charleston,
Calamity said, strolling over to kick at my fingers. Light flashed in the room. Then, someone punched Calamity square in the face, sending him sprawling. The rushing of air stopped, and I gasped in a huge breath, looking up at the newcomer. Prof. He wore his black lab coat and no longer bore the vacant look that had been in his eyes when I'd left him. It was replaced by an expression of determination and sheer grit.
You,
Calamity said, sprawled on his back.
I reclaimed the powers from you.
Prof pulled apart his lab coat. There, strapped to his chest, was the vest that Nighthawk had made, quickly repaired, motivators replaced.
Useless,
Calamity said.
If I reclaimed them, that shouldn't work. He
looked befuddled at the force field on the wall, which glowed green. Prof offered me his hand. I let out a long sigh of relief. How do you feel? I asked, taking the hand. Haunted, he whispered. Thank you for bringing me back. I hate you for it, David. But thank you. I didn't bring you back, I said. You faced it, Prof. I suddenly understood. In strapping on the motivators and trying to take up his powers again after what had happened, he'd faced them. He'd come to risk failure. He'd done it. He'd claimed the powers. Like Megan, he'd ripped the darkness from the abilities and sent one sprawling away while seizing the others. Prof's powers were now his and not Calamity's. The motivator boxes were meaningless. Prof grabbed me, perhaps intending to teleport us away, but a sudden wave of something slammed into us, sending us sprawling. Calamity started glowing again, a harsh red light, and he spoke. Sparks, that voice! Inhuman, unreal. Something tumbled from Prof's hand, and it vaporized as Calamity pointed. What was that? I asked over the terrible screeching that was now Calamity's voice, speaking a language I couldn't conceive.
That was our way out,
Prof said.
Run.
The teleporter. Hell. I scrambled to my feet as Prof placed a force field between us and Calamity, but it was gone in a heartbeat. Fighting him was impossible. Some unseen force tossed me to the ground. Calamity glowed and raised his hands, a beam forming, then shooting right toward me. Light flashed again, and the beam missed. Megan stood in the room, holding Obliteration by the throat. He appeared to be choking. I gaped in surprise as she tossed the man aside. He vanished a moment later, not in his customary fashion, but just fading away. Megan raised her gun and started firing at Calamity. It still didn't do any good, though Calamity screamed again in that strange language. Megan cursed and dropped down to a crouch beside me. "Plan?" she asked. Megan, how did you... "Easy," she said, firing again. Grabbed the Obliteration from the other dimension, showed him the picture of this place, and made him take me up here. He's still a slonce there, I'll have you know. Now, plan? Plan. Sometimes you don't know what you need until you're in the thick of it. "Send us both," I said, stumbling to my feet. "Send Calamity and me into Firefight's world, but not out in space. Please, send us to Firefight, wherever he is." "David, Calamity will kill you. Please, Megan, please, trust me." She drew her lips to a line, and as I lurched toward Calamity in the shaking room, she released her powers. I grabbed him, and together the two of us slipped into another place. 50. We stumbled onto a rooftop in Ildethia, near a gaping hole smoldering in the ground. Night had fallen. Darkness covered the Salt City, but I recognized the location. It was above where I'd faced down Prof at the end. At first, I thought something had gone wrong. Had we really entered another dimension? But there were differences. Here, the hole looked like it had been made by an explosion, rather than by the tensors. There were also far fewer bodies. I turned and found that Calamity was standing there growling at me. He raised his hands, summoning light. "I can show you," I whispered, "what it is we see in the earth. You say you're curious. I can show you something you will wish to see. I promise." He sneered at me, but as I watched, his rage seemed to subside, like an epic when their powers retreated. "You're curious," I said. "I know you are. Don't you want to understand, finally, so that your curiosity will stop nagging at you?" "Bah!" he said, but lowered his hands and transformed into Larsener. Well, he'd always been Larsener, but he'd stopped glowing. His skin had returned to a human tone, and his robe had transformed to the shirt and slacks he often wore. "What do you think to do here?" he demanded, looking around. "This is another core possibility, isn't it? One adjacent to yours? You realize I can just send us back." "Specs!" Firefight's voice said. I twisted to find him on the next rooftop over, standing near Tavi. She remained behind, studying me while Firefight jumped, gliding across the open space, trailing flames. "He's here!" Firefight said, obviously speaking into a mobile. How had he found one that didn't burn up? "Yes, him." "Can you summon the person who wants to meet me?" I asked Firefight, glancing toward Calamity. "Oh, don't worry," Firefight said. "He's coming." "There is something strange about this place," Calamity said, looking up and squinting at the sky. "Something wrong." "It's a world that you left, Calamity," I said. It's a world where some epics don't destroy, where some protect and fight against those who would kill.
Impossible!
He spun on me.
Lies!
You know your powers, I said. You know what Megan does. You told me yourself you are their master. Before, you demanded that I deny what I was. Well, I don't. Not anymore. I'm one of you. Now you do it. I dare you to deny what you're seeing. Deny that this place, this possibility exists. He seemed bewildered. He looked up at the dark sky where Calamity should have been. Powerful spotlights lit the area nearby, where people searched for survivors in the aftermath of whatever conflict Firefight and his team had faced. Down below, when people saw him standing near me, they cheered. Sparks, they cheered an epic.
No,
Calamity said. He looked at Firefight, then the people.
This one must. He must be an anomaly, like your Megan.
Is that so? I said, scanning the area. I spotted a figure rising from the city, the figure I'd been waiting for. He streaked toward us, cape fluttering behind, an outfit I knew all too well. I seized Calamity by the front of his clothing. Look at it, I said. Look at a place where the epics are free from your corruption. Look at the one who comes, the most terrible of them all, a murderer in our world, a destroyer. Look and see that here, Calamity, Steelheart himself is a hero. I thrust my hand to the side as the figure landed on the rooftop.
That,
Calamity said.
that is not Steelheart.
What? I looked at the figure again. Magnificent silver cape, baggy black pants, a shirt stretched taut across a powerful physique. It was Steelheart's costume, though it now bore a symbol on the chest. That was the only difference in the clothing. But his face was that of a kindly man, not a tyrant. Round features, thinning hair, a wide smile, and such understanding eyes. Blaine Charleston. My father. 51. My David. Father whispered. My little David. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. It was him. In this world, my father was an epic. No, in this world, my father was the epic. He took a hesitant step forward. Such a timid action for one who bore the musculature, stature, and regal air of a powerful epic. Oh, son. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I released Calamity, stunned. Father took another step forward. Then I seized him in an embrace. It all came out. The worry, the terror, the frustration, and mind-numbing exhaustion. It poured out in heaving sobs. I released over a decade of pain and sorrow, a decade of loss. He held me tight, and he smelled like my father, epic or not. Son, he said, clutching me, weeping. I killed you. I didn't mean to. I tried to protect you, to save you. But you died. You died anyway. I let you die, I whispered. I didn't help you, didn't stand up. I watched him murder you. I was a coward. Our words became a jumble as we spoke. But for a moment, somehow, everything was all right. I was in my father's arms. Impossible, yet true.
But it is him,
Calamity whispered from behind.
I can see the powers. The same powers.
I finally released my father, though he kept a grip on my arm, protective. Calamity stared at the sky again. You brought him here, my father said. Calamity nodded absently. Thank you, hero, my father said, speaking with a confidence I hadn't known in him since before Mother's death. Thank you for giving me this gift. You must be a mighty man of compassion in your realm. Calamity looked at us, frowning, from my father to me and back.
By the eternal sparks, Calamity whispered. I see it.
I felt the fading sensation. Megan's power was running out, and we would soon return. I grabbed my father again. I'm going, I said. I don't have a choice, but... Father, I forgive you. Know that I forgive you. It didn't need to be said, yet I knew that I had to say it. I forgive you, Father said, tears in his eyes. My David, it is enough to know that somewhere you still live. The world faded, and with it my father. I anticipated pain, a lurching, a tearing away. But I felt only peace. He was right. It was enough. Calamity and I reappeared on the glass space station. Megan and Prof stood at the ready, her with her gun, Prof with spears of light. I raised my hands to still them. Calamity remained in his human form. He didn't change back. He simply knelt on that glass floor, staring sightlessly. A small red glow finally started to rise from him, and he looked at us.
You are evil,
he said, almost a plea. I am not, Megan said.
You will destroy everything, he said.
No, Prof said, his voice rough. No. Calamity focused on me, standing with the other two. Your corruption isn't enough, I said. Your fears are not enough. Your hatred is not enough. We won't do it, Calamity. He wrapped his arms around himself and began to rock. Do you know what made the difference? I demanded of him. The reason our powers separated from yours? The same thing happened with all of us. Megan running into a burning building, me entering the ocean, Edmund with the dog, and Prof coming here. It wasn't only confronting the fears.
It was pushing through them,
Calamity whispered, looking from me to the others.
To save someone.
Do you fear that? I asked him softly. That we aren't what you've thought? Does it terrify you to know that deep down, men are not monsters? That we are instead inherently good? He stared at me, then collapsed, curling up on the glass floor. The red light within him dimmed, and then, just like that, he faded away until there was nothing. Did we kill him? Megan asked. Close enough, I said. The station rumbled, then lurched. I knew this thing was too low for such an orbital speed, Prof shouted. Sparks, we need to call Tia and... He grew pale. The entire station lurched, throwing us to the ceiling. Calamity had been holding it in place. It started to crack, glass all around spiderwebbing from the internal pressure. In seconds, we were plummeting toward the Earth, the station shattering around us. But I was calm. For in that other world, my father's shirt had borne a symbol. A symbol I recognized. A stylized S shape. A symbol that meant something. The symbol of the faithful. There will be heroes. Just wait. I seized the power within me. Epilogue. I sat on the hillside, resting in the shadow of the fallen space station, which I'd transformed to steel as we fell. I'd made the transformation, then exited through one of the holes in its side. I'd grabbed hold, slowing it, then guided it out of its death spiral and eventually placed it here. Well, crashed it here. Turns out flying is way harder than people think. In the air, I was about as adroit as 17 geriatric walruses trying to juggle live swordfish. Might need to work on that one. Megan walked over, looking radiant as always, despite the bruises from the, smoothness-challenged landing. She sat down and squeezed my arm. "So," she said, "you going to get super buff?" "Dunno," I said, flexing. "Steelheart was, and my father is. Might come with the portfolio." Should make up for the terrible kissing. Hey, all you have to do to fix that is let me practice. Noted. We were somewhere in Australia, according to Nighthawk, who was sending a copter for us. It would be hours before it arrived. I wasn't about to trust my flying skills to get us back to North America. I nodded toward the other hillside. "How is he?" "Bad," Megan said, looking toward Prof's silhouette, where he sat staring into the sky. "He'll have to live with it, as I do. The things we've done while consumed by the darkness. Well, they feel like our own actions. Dreamlike sometimes, but still our choice. You can remember enjoying it, too." She shivered, and I pulled her close. After this, Prof would never be the same. But then would any of us? "His powers still work?" I said. "Like yours do?" She nodded, glancing at her mobile. "Abraham and Cody are doing well, though Prof will need to regrow Abraham's arm, and, you should read this." She showed me a message she had pulled up from Nighthawk. "Mizzy?" I asked. Megan nodded. "Sparks. I wonder how she'll take to being an epic." "Well, without the darkness," Megan shrugged. "It was well and truly gone so far as we could tell." Megan still thought Calamity might return. I didn't. A flash of light appeared in front of us, resolving into a man with spectacles and a goatee, wearing a trench coat.
"Ah," Obliteration said. "You are here."
He tucked away the mobile he'd been carrying. Maybe we wouldn't need that copter after all. I took a deep breath and stood, hopeful. I gave Obliteration a smile and reached out my hand to him. He slid his sword from its sheath. Yes, he still had a sword, and pointed it at me.
"You have done well, and blessed are you, for you have cast the dragon from his heaven. I will give you a week to recover. My next target is Toronto. You may face me there, and we shall see what comes of our clash, horseman."
"Obliteration," I said, pleading. "Calamity is gone."
"Yes," he said, sheathing his sword.
"The darkness is gone," I said. "You don't have to be evil."
"I'm not," he said. "I thank you for giving me the secrets you know, Steel Slayer. I know why the darkness left me 5 years ago, when I faced my fear. I have been free of it ever since." He nodded to me. "And he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the Tree of Life." He flashed into white ceramic and vanished.
Calamity, I said, slumping back down, frustrated. Calamity! You know, Megan said, we might need to think of new curses. I had hoped maybe on our side he would be good, once Calamity was gone. They're people, Megan said. Free to be people, David, as it should be. And that means some of them are still going to be selfish, or messed up, or whatever. She settled closer to me. I'm feeling rested, and am up for some exertion. I grinned. Practice! She rolled her eyes. Not that I'm averse, Knees, but I was referring to my powers. Oh, right. I knew that. You still want to try this? She asked. Yeah, absolutely. He'll be waiting. All right. Sit still. A moment later, I was back in the other world. I'd returned once already. Just after we'd landed the space station, I'd popped in to let them know that my visit before hadn't been the end. But I'd stayed only for a moment. Megan had been tired. Before I'd left, though, I'd arranged this meeting place. My father stood on top of a building, Sharp Tower, which hadn't been destroyed in his world. I walked up to him, noting his fluttering cape. Look what those comic books have done to you. Wearing a symbol and everything. Sparks, he was such a nerd. Like father, like son, I guess. He saw me and turned around with a wide smile of his own. I stepped toward him, hesitant. 11 years. A long time to catch up on. How did one begin? I said. Megan feels she's getting better at this, and the darkness is gone, so she can last longer. Now that she's rested and isn't in the middle of a catastrophe or anything, she thinks she can give us a good 15 minutes. Maybe as long as a half hour. Good, good, Father said. He shuffled awkwardly. Firefight tells me that you and I share a power set. Yeah, I said. Power blasts, invulnerability? Oh, and turning stuff into steel. Not sure how useful that last one will be. You'd be surprised, he said. It's still going to take some getting used to. And by the way, flying is kind of kicking me in the face. Flying is tricky at first. We stood in front of one another, uncertain, until Father nodded toward the railing. Do you, maybe, want me to teach you? I smiled, feeling a sudden warmth deep inside. Dad, I can think of nothing I'd like more.
This book is over, but the story continues. Keep listening after the credits to hear the beginning of Mitosis, a Reckoner story. Book 4 in the Reckoner series, free.
This has been an Audible Studio.
All right. Wow. Good book. All right. Wow.
Go, go, go! Life on, life on, life on! Run for it! Run for it!